The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped beneath the front door of a narrow townhouse on Gloucester Street, before the housekeeper had even set the kettle to boil. It was sealed with black wax and carried no return address. The handwriting on the front was precise and careful, the kind of handwriting that belonged to a man who had spent years making sure every word he wrote looked exactly as deliberate as it was. Margaret Harlow picked it up from the floor herself, still wearing her morning shawl, her tea untouched on the side table. She turned it over twice. She did not open it immediately. Something about the weight of it made her pause. Margaret was 23 years old. She had come to London 6 weeks earlier with her aunt, a widow named Clara Ashby, who had a small income, a large appetite for society, and an absolute conviction that a niece with Margaret's face and composure could do very well for herself if only she were placed in the right rooms. Clara was not a cruel woman. She was simply one who had grown up understanding that the world rewarded beauty when it was paired with obedience, and she had raised Margaret accordingly. Margaret had been taught to play the pianoforte, to read French with a moderate accent, to enter a room without drawing attention to herself while still being noticed, and to speak only when spoken to in the presence of people who mattered. She had not been taught what to do when a letter sealed in black wax arrived before breakfast from a man she had met only once. She had met him at the Ellsworth dinner. It was the sort of gathering that Clara had spent 3 weeks angling to be invited to, calling in every social debt she had accumulated over 2 years of careful positioning in London's outer circles. The Ellsworth house on Park Lane was one of the grandest in the city, and their dinners were attended by exactly the kind of people whose names appeared in the newspapers the following morning. Margaret had worn her best dress, a soft grey silk that Clara had insisted upon despite the cost, and she had sat at the lower end of the table between a retired colonel with poor hearing and a clergyman's wife who talked without pause about her garden in Suffolk. She had not expected to be noticed at all. But halfway through the third course, she had looked up from her plate and found a man watching her from the far end of the table. He was perhaps 55 years old, with silver hair worn in the old style, and a face that had once been handsome and still carried the memory of it. He wore his coat with the ease of someone who had never in his life needed to consider whether it was appropriate for the occasion, because every occasion arranged itself around him. He had the kind of stillness that powerful men develop over decades, a complete absence of the nervous energy that ordinary people carry in their shoulders and their hands. He simply sat there, at the head of the table, watching her with the quiet certainty of a man who was accustomed to looking at things that belonged to him. His name was Edmund Calder, the Duke of Ashbourne. Clara had gripped Margaret's wrist under the table when she realized the Duke had taken notice. Not hard enough to hurt, just firmly enough to communicate everything that needed to be communicated without a word being spoken. Margaret had smiled politely in the Duke's direction, then looked back at her plate and said nothing more for the rest of the evening. On the carriage ride home, Clara had been incapable of silence. "He looked at you 3 times, she said. "I counted 3 distinct times, and when you stood up after dinner he watched you cross the room. Do you understand what that means? Do you have any idea who that man is?" Margaret understood perfectly well who the man was. Everyone in London understood who the Duke of Ashbourne was. He was the kind of man who existed in a different layer of the world than ordinary people, a layer where ordinary rules did not apply with the same force, and where ordinary consequences did not arrive with the same certainty. He had served in Parliament for 30 years. He owned properties in 4 counties. His name appeared in histories of the previous century. His portrait hung in 2 different buildings that Margaret had visited on guided tour before she had any reason to think she would ever be in a room with him. And now his letter was in her hands before breakfast on a Tuesday in November. She opened it. The language was formal and gracious. He was hosting a small dinner the following Friday. He hoped she and her aunt might be able to attend. There would be perhaps 12 guests, he said, intimate by his usual standards. He had enjoyed meeting her at the Ellsworth house and hoped the acquaintance might be continued. The letter was signed with his full title and his personal seal. Clara was at the breakfast table within 4 minutes of Margaret showing her the letter. She read it twice with her reading glasses on, then once more with them off, as though the words might change between viewings. "You will go," Clara said. Margaret said nothing. "Margaret, you will go." "I heard you." "Then why aren't you saying yes?" "I am thinking." Clara set the letter down with the careful movements of a woman who was trying very hard not to say something she would regret. "What is there to think about? A duke has invited you to dinner. In 30 years of navigating this city, I have never once received a personal invitation from a man of his standing. Never, not once. And you are sitting there thinking." Margaret drank her tea. It had gone cold. "I do not know him," she said. "You will know him better after Friday." This was the conversation that began it. It is easy, looking back from the distance of years, to see the moment when the path divided, when one choice closed off all the others and set in motion everything that followed. Margaret would look back on that Tuesday morning many times in the years ahead. She would remember the cold tea. She would remember the weight of the letter. She would remember Clara's voice, not unkind exactly, but carrying the particular tone of a woman who had decided that the most important thing in the world was a duke's attention, and that any hesitation in the face of it was a kind of madness. What Margaret could not have known on that Tuesday morning was that she was not the first young woman to receive such a letter. She could not have known that the Duke's secretary kept a careful record of certain invitations, separate from the household accounts, in a small locked book that would eventually find its way into other hands. She could not have known that at least 2 other women in London that same autumn had sat in morning rooms with similar letters, and had made similar decisions, and had been similarly unable to explain afterward exactly how things had progressed so far so quickly. She could not have known any of this because no one had told her, no one had thought to warn her. No one in Clara's circle would have spoken such a thing aloud, and even if they had wished to, the words for what the Duke was and what he did not exist in the vocabulary that respectable women were permitted to use in 1812. London in the autumn of 1812 was a city that had learned to perform its own respectability with enormous skill. The war with France was grinding on across the Channel, and the newspapers were full of battles and movements, and the names of young officers who had died in places their mothers could not pronounce. But in the drawing rooms and dining rooms of Mayfair and St. James's, the war felt very far away. The season was the rhythm of life, the endless rotation of dinners and dances and morning calls and theater evenings and card parties that constituted the social world of the upper class. Reputation was the currency by which people lived or failed to live. A woman's reputation was more fragile and more valuable than a man's, and everyone understood this, and the understanding was so deep and so old that it had stopped feeling like an injustice and had become simply the way things were. A man like the Duke of Ashbourne operated at the very top of this world. He was not merely rich, though he was extraordinarily rich. He was not merely powerful, though his political connections reached into every corner of government. He was old in the sense that his family had been part of England's story for so long that his name alone carried a kind of historical weight. When he entered a room, conversations shifted. When he offered an opinion, people wrote it down. When he invited someone to dinner, the invitation was understood as something more than a social courtesy. It was a signal, an acknowledgement, a form of elevation. Clara Ashby had grasped this immediately. Margaret grasped it too, but what she felt about it was more complicated than what her aunt felt. Margaret was not naive. She had grown up watching her mother navigate a world that was structured entirely in favor of men with money and entirely against women without it. She had seen what happened to women who relied too heavily on one man's favor and were then left without it. She had read enough, in the privacy of her own room with books Clara would not have approved of, to understand that the world described in drawing-room conversation was not the same world that existed behind the closed doors of great houses. She had her own opinions about most things, opinions she had learned to keep very quiet. But she was also 23, and she was not wealthy, and she had no prospects that did not depend on the goodwill of people who were wealthier than she was. And the Duke of Ashbourne had looked at her across a dinner table in a way that made her feel, for one complicated moment, like the most interesting person in the room. She wrote the acceptance herself. Clara watched over her shoulder and suggested 2 changes to the wording, both of which Margaret made without comment. The letter was sent that afternoon by their housekeeper's boy, who returned 40 minutes later with a brief note of acknowledgement from the Duke's secretary confirming the arrangement for Friday evening. Clara spent the rest of the week in a state of barely controlled excitement. She discussed the dinner at breakfast, at lunch, and while they were preparing for bed. She debated the question of what Margaret should wear with a seriousness usually reserved for matters of genuine consequence. She wrote letters to 3 of her friends in which she mentioned, with studied casualness, that Margaret had received a personal invitation from the Duke of Ashbourne. Margaret watched all of this with a feeling she could not quite name, something between amusement and apprehension, like watching a storm gather on a horizon that was much closer than it had first appeared. On the Thursday before the dinner, a small parcel arrived. Inside was a pair of gloves, white kid leather of a quality that Clara's entire annual clothing allowance could not have purchased. There was no accompanying note. The parcel had come from a shop on Bond Street, and the shop's account, had Margaret known to look for it, would have shown a standing order in the Duke's name. Clara held the gloves up to the light and said nothing for a long moment. "He sent them," she said at last. "It appears so. You cannot return them." "I know. It would be a terrible insult." "I understand that." Clara set the gloves down carefully, as though they were made of something fragile. Then she looked at Margaret with an expression that was not quite happiness and not quite worry, but something that occupied the uneasy space between the two. "Be very careful on Friday," she said. It was the closest she ever came to saying what she actually meant. Margaret waited, hoping that something more direct would follow. But Clara picked up her needlework and said nothing else, and the moment passed as moments do, leaving behind it only the faint shape of what had almost been spoken. Friday came with a grey sky and a cold wind off the Thames. Margaret put on the grey silk dress and the white gloves and sat very still while the housekeeper arranged her hair. She looked at herself in the glass for a moment before she left the room, not with vanity but with the careful attention of someone conducting a final inventory. She looked composed. She looked appropriate. She looked exactly like the kind of young woman who would be invited to a small dinner at the Duke of Ashbourne's house, and who would go, and who would behave correctly, and about whom no one would think twice afterward. She did not look like someone standing at the beginning of the most consequential weeks of her life. She did not know that yet. The Duke's house on Grosvenor Square was lit from every window when the carriage arrived. A footman met them at the door before they had even descended from the cab, which Clara noted with visible approval, since it meant they had been watched for. The entrance hall was enormous, with marble floors and a staircase that curved upward into a warmly lit upper landing. A butler of advanced years and perfect stillness took their wraps and informed them that His Grace was receiving guests in the yellow drawing room on the first floor. There were not 12 guests, there were 7. Margaret counted as she entered the room, and a small, quiet part of her noted this discrepancy between what the letter had promised and what was actually present. 7 people, including herself and Clara, arranged in the comfortable furniture of a room that was large enough to hold 30, and somehow made 7 feel like exactly the right number. The Duke stood near the fireplace and came forward immediately when they entered, which was itself a small social signal, since men of his position generally did not trouble themselves to cross a room for guests who were not of equal standing. He took Margaret's hand and said he was very glad she had come. She said she was glad to be there. And the evening began. The conversation at dinner was easy and well managed, the kind that a practiced host produces the way a skilled musician produces music, with no apparent effort and no visible seam between one moment and the next. The Duke talked about the theatre, about recent parliamentary debates, about a painting he had recently acquired from a private collection in Florence. He was funny when he chose to be, and he chose to be at the right moments. He drew people out without appearing to try. He asked Margaret 2 questions during the soup course, and listened to her answers with the kind of attention that made it feel as though everything she said was slightly more interesting than she had realized. Clara, seated 2 places further down, was watching all of this with the carefully arranged expression of a woman who was absolutely delighted and absolutely determined not to show it. After dinner the group separated, as was customary, and Margaret found herself in the yellow drawing room with 2 of the other women while the men remained at the table. One of the women was the wife of a parliamentary colleague of the Duke's, stout and friendly and interested mainly in her eldest son's recent promotion. The other was a pale, quiet woman of about 35 who had come alone and who did not volunteer her name and whom no one introduced. Margaret noticed that this woman drank her tea without speaking and watched the door that led back to the dining room with a fixed attention that did not look like the ordinary impatience of someone waiting for the evening to continue. Margaret thought about her later. She thought about her quite a lot. The men rejoined them after perhaps 40 minutes, and the evening continued for another hour before guests began to take their leave. The Duke escorted each departing guest to the top of the stairs himself, another small gesture that carried considerable social weight when one understood the code. When it was Margaret and Clara's turn, he held Margaret's hand a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and said he hoped very much that this would not be the last time he had the pleasure of their company. Clara thanked him warmly enough for both of them. In the carriage going home, she was already talking about the next dinner before they had turned the first corner. Margaret sat with her hands folded in her lap and watched the dark streets of Mayfair slide past the window and said very little. She was thinking about the white gloves, still on her hands. She was thinking about the pale woman who had watched the door. She was thinking about the Duke's expression at the precise moment he had held her hand slightly too long, and about the absolute confidence in it, the complete absence of any doubt that this was something she wanted as much as he did. She could not have said, even to herself, whether it was or it wasn't. That uncertainty was perhaps the most dangerous thing about the entire evening. It would take months and a great deal of pain before she understood what it meant. The second invitation came 8 days later. This one was different from the first. It was shorter, written in a hand that was less formal, almost conversational, and it named only Margaret, not Clara. It suggested an evening at the theatre, a private box for a performance of a new play at Drury Lane, and mentioned that he would be accompanied by a small party of friends. The word small appeared again, the same word from the first letter, and Margaret noticed it this time in a way she had not the first time, because she was already beginning to learn the vocabulary of these invitations, learning to read what lay beneath the surface of the words. She showed it to Clara. Clara read it twice and said, "This is very good." "He has not invited you," Margaret said. "He has invited you, which amounts to the same thing. I will come as your companion. That is entirely proper." Margaret was not sure it was entirely proper. The absence of Clara's name from the letter seemed to her significant, a deliberate choice rather than an oversight. But she did not know how to say this without saying something else at the same time, something about the Duke and his intentions that would require her to have a conversation with Clara that Clara clearly did not wish to have. She accepted. Clara arranged a new ribbon for Margaret's best evening bonnet. The theatre box was on the first tier, private and enclosed, with velvet curtains at the sides that could be partially drawn if one wished, and a view of the stage that was excellent from certain angles and somewhat less excellent from others. When Margaret and Clara arrived, there were 4 other people already in the box. The Duke rose immediately, which he always did, and made introductions. 2 of the people were people Margaret had met at the dinner, faces she recognized and could attach to names. The other 2 were new to her, a man of about 40 with a pleasant, forgettable manner and a young woman named Frances Hartley, who was perhaps a year or 2 older than Margaret and who was attending, she said, on behalf of her brother who had sent his apologies. Frances Hartley was pretty in a very finished sort of way, the kind of woman who had clearly spent a great deal of time learning how to present herself in exactly the right light. She had a small, careful smile that she deployed at intervals, and a way of listening to conversations that suggested she was paying attention to things other than the words being spoken. Margaret sat between Clara and the Duke, which was how the seating had been arranged before she arrived. The play was competent and occasionally amusing. Margaret watched it with the front part of her attention, while the back part of her attention occupied itself with other observations. She noticed that the Duke spoke to her more than he spoke to anyone else in the box. She noticed that when he leaned slightly toward her to make a comment about something on the stage, the distance between them was less than the ordinary distance of social courtesy, and that he did not seem to be aware of this, or at least performed not being aware of it very convincingly. She noticed that Frances Hartley watched this happen twice, and then looked deliberately at the stage and did not look back for several minutes. At the interval, Clara engaged the forgettable man in conversation about something, and the Duke turned to Margaret and asked her what she thought of the play. She said what she actually thought, which was that the second act had been stronger than the first, but that the actress in the leading role was performing somewhat above the level of the material she had been given. The Duke looked at her with what appeared to be genuine surprise and then genuine pleasure. "That is exactly right," he said. "I have been thinking the same thing since the curtain went up. You have a good eye." "I read a great deal," Margaret said. "It makes one accustomed to noticing when a story is better than its telling." "And are you accustomed to noticing a great many things?" She looked at him steadily. "I try to be." He smiled. It was a measured smile, not the broad public smile he used in company, but something narrower and more private. "I believe you," he said. Second act began and conversation returned to its polite surface channels, but something had shifted in the air of the box, some small adjustment in the angle of things that both of them felt and neither of them acknowledged. Clara, who had been watching from the corner of her vision, touched Margaret's arm as they were leaving at the end of the evening and murmured, "You were charming tonight." It was the only thing she said, but she said it with an intensity that suggested she had been holding it back for 2 hours. The following week brought a note, not a formal invitation but a handwritten few lines, asking whether Margaret had enjoyed the play and recommending another that was opening the following month at a different theater. He mentioned a book he thought she might enjoy, something about the history of Italian art, and said that if she wished to borrow it she could send word and he would have it delivered. It was the kind of note that established contact without requiring anything in return, the kind that could be read as pure courtesy if one chose to read it that way. Clara chose to read it that way. Margaret borrowed the book. It arrived the next morning with a small handwritten inscription inside the front cover, not personal exactly, but particular, a line about the Florentine painters that was addressed specifically to her, that acknowledged their conversation from the evening at his house about his painting from Florence. It told her that he had been paying attention, that he remembered what she had said. She read the book in 4 days. She found it genuinely interesting, which made everything more complicated than it would have been if the book had been dull. She wrote a brief note of thanks and returned the book with her own response to the inscription, a single sentence about one of the painters mentioned in the chapter she had found most engaging. It was the kind of note that could not be objected to. It was polite and intelligent and well within the boundaries of what was acceptable. She wrote it 3 times before she was satisfied with the wording, and she was not sure, even as she sent it, whether she was writing it because she genuinely wanted to or because she had already begun, without entirely realizing it, to calculate what he wanted her to do and to do it. This is one of the things about these situations that makes them difficult to explain afterward. The choices appear to be choices. They appear to be freely made, one after another, each one small enough to seem manageable, each one creating the conditions for the next. It is only from the outside at considerable distance that the pattern becomes visible. At the time, Margaret was simply navigating her life with the tools she had, in a world that offered young women of her position very few tools to navigate with. The 3rd invitation came at the end of November. It was for a dinner, again at the Duke's house on Grosvenor Square, and this time Clara's name was included. There would be 10 guests, the letter said. Margaret mentioned the number to Clara, who said briskly that 10 was a very respectable number for an intimate dinner. The evening began with 10 people and ended with 5. It happened gradually, the way these things always happened. Before dinner there were apologies conveyed by footmen. One guest had been called away on urgent family business. Another had fallen ill. A third had sent a note that arrived so late it was delivered during the 2nd course, which Clara found somewhat rude, though she did not say so in the presence of the Duke. By the time the fish course was cleared, the gathering around the table had thinned to 5 people, and by the time port was being considered, it was 4, and then Clara allowed herself to be drawn into a lengthy discussion about property law with the one remaining gentleman, a conversation that required them both to move to the far end of the drawing room to consult a document the gentleman had in his coat pocket, which left Margaret with the Duke. He showed her the painting from Florence. It was hanging in a small room off the drawing room, a room lined with books and lit by a single lamp near the window, and the painting was just as he had described it, luminous and detailed and strange in the way that very old things sometimes are. She stood in front of it and talked about what she saw in it, and he stood beside her and agreed or offered other observations, and the conversation was genuinely interesting in the way that their conversations had always been genuinely interesting, which was part of what made everything so difficult. They were in that room for perhaps 20 minutes. Clara was still discussing property law. When they returned to the drawing room, nothing had happened that could be named or described. But something had shifted in the atmosphere of the evening, something that Margaret could feel without being able to explain it, a sense of enclosure, of having moved one step further along a path that she had not agreed to be on, but was nonetheless further along than she had been an hour before. She thought about this in the carriage going home. Clara was in high spirits talking about the dinner, about what a gracious host the Duke was, about how Margaret seemed to be doing very well with him. Margaret listened and said the appropriate things and kept her hands very still in her lap. Back in her room she took off the white gloves, the same ones he had sent before the first dinner, and held them for a moment. They were still beautiful, still of a quality she could not have afforded herself. She put them carefully away in the drawer and sat down on the edge of her bed in the dark and tried to think clearly. She was not afraid, she was not sure what she was. She thought about the pale woman from the first dinner, the one who had watched the door and not offered her name. She thought about Frances Hartley at the theatre, who had watched the Duke lean toward Margaret and then looked away. She wondered what those women's stories were, whether they had their own evenings, their own drawings rooms lined with books and lit by single lamps, their own conversations in front of Italian paintings. She thought about the book she had borrowed and returned, and the note she had written, and the way the Duke had looked at her when she said she was accustomed to noticing a great many things. She thought, I need to be more careful. She was not yet sure what being more careful would actually require. She did not yet understand the scale of what she was navigating, but she was beginning to understand that whatever she had thought this was, whatever word she had been using in her own mind to describe these evenings and these invitations and these gifts and these conversations, it was not the right word. The right word was something that she did not have yet. She would find it eventually. The finding of it would cost her almost everything. But on that November night, in the dark of her room on Gloucester Street, she simply sat and listened to the house settle and thought about the painting in the small room with the single lamp, and about the particular quality of the Duke's attention, and about how very little any of it resembled what it appeared to be. In the morning she rose and dressed and came down to breakfast and said nothing to Clara about any of this. Clara was already talking about Christmas and what it might mean for their social calendar if the Duke's attentions continued in the direction they appeared to be continuing. She spoke about it with the careful excitement of a woman who had staked a great deal on a single hand and was beginning to believe it might come good. Margaret drank her tea and watched the street through the window and said that yes, the dinner had been very pleasant. Outside, London went about its business in the cold grey light of early December. Carriages rattled past. A dog barked somewhere on the other side of the square. A woman selling flowers called her wares in a high clear voice that carried through the glass. The city was its usual indifferent self, enormous and unknowing and absolutely uninterested in the particular complicated situation of one young woman sitting at a breakfast table with cold tea and too many thoughts. London never had been interested in that kind of story. Or rather, London was very interested in it, but only once it had already gone wrong. A week passed, then 10 days. The holiday season brought a pause in formal entertainments, and Margaret spent Christmas with Clara at the house of Clara's sister in Hampstead, where the conversation centered on family matters and the cold, and a distant cousin who had done something mildly scandalous involving a horse race. Margaret was relieved by the ordinariness of it. She slept well in the small bedroom under the eaves and ate too much goose and played cards in the evenings, and did not think, for several days at a time, about any of it. Then New Year came and the city came alive again, and a letter arrived at Gloucester Street before they had even properly unpacked from Hampstead. It was from the Duke's secretary this time, rather than the Duke himself. Very formal, very proper, requesting the pleasure of Miss Harlowe's company at a small gathering on the 8th of January. An evening of music, it said, several distinguished guests, refreshments would be provided, the carriage would be sent if Miss Harlowe preferred not to arrange her own conveyance. A carriage sent. Clara pressed her fingers to her mouth when she read that part. He is sending a carriage, she said. So I see. Margaret, do you understand what that means? Margaret understood what it meant. It meant that the Duke had decided the distance between where things were and where he wanted them to be was now small enough to close with a gesture. A carriage sent was a declaration, not of love, but of something that operated in the same territory by entirely different rules. It was a statement of intention. It was the kind of thing from which, once accepted, it became very difficult to gracefully withdraw. She accepted. The carriage came on the 8th of January, a cold, clear night with frost on the cobblestones and a moon sharp as a blade over the rooftops. Clara was not mentioned in this letter and could not be brought without an explicit inclusion. She stood in the entrance hall of their house on Gloucester Street and watched Margaret leave in the Duke's carriage and said nothing, which was itself a kind of answer to the question neither of them had asked aloud. There were no other guests at the musical evening. There was no music. There was a footman at the door and a butler at the staircase and a fire in the upstairs drawing room, and the Duke standing beside it in a wine-colored coat, perfectly at ease, as though there were nothing unusual about inviting a young woman alone to his house under the pretense of a gathering that did not exist. He apologized for the other guests, who had all, unfortunately, been prevented from attending by various unavoidable circumstances. He hoped she had not been inconvenienced by the journey. He offered her a glass of wine. She stood in the center of the room in her coat, not yet having removed it, and held herself very still. "There are no other guests," she said. "I am afraid not," he said. "I am sorry for the confusion." He did not look sorry. He looked like a man who had arranged things exactly as he intended to arrange them, and who was now waiting to see how she would respond. Margaret had two options. She could leave. She had the carriage still at the door, and she had her own will and her own legs, and no one was stopping her from walking back down the stairs and going home. She understood this clearly. She also understood just as clearly what leaving would mean. It would mean that this ended here. It would mean that the Duke's interest would shift elsewhere. It would mean that Clara's 3 months of careful social investment came to nothing. It would mean that Margaret returned to being what she had been before the letter in black wax arrived. A young woman in a narrow house on Gloucester Street with no particular prospects, and a guardian aunt with a small income and large hopes. She was 23 years old, and she had been taught, all her life, that a woman's security came from the goodwill of people more powerful than herself. She took off her coat. She handed it to the waiting footman. She sat down by the fire and accepted the glass of wine. And the fourth evening began. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a person who has made a decision they know is wrong and have made it anyway. It is not guilt exactly, not at first. It is something quieter and more persistent, like a low note held beneath all the other notes of ordinary life. Margaret carried that silence home with her on the night of January the 8th, sitting alone in the Duke's carriage as it rattled back through the frost-covered streets toward Gloucester Street, watching the lamplight slide across the ceiling of the cab and trying to arrange her thoughts into some order that made sense. The evening had been what it had been. She would not describe it to anyone. She would not find the words for it, not that night, not for some months afterward, and when she did eventually find the words, she would write them down in a small notebook that she kept locked in the drawer of her writing desk. But that night, returning through the cold streets of London, she simply sat with the fact of what had happened and tried to understand where exactly she was. Clara was waiting up. She looked at Margaret when she came through the door and did not ask a single question, which told Margaret that she knew enough not to need asking and had decided that knowing too precisely would be an inconvenience. They said good night in the hallway with the ordinary courtesy of two people who have silently agreed to leave something unexamined. Margaret went upstairs and Clara went to her room, and neither of them spoke about that evening. Not the next day, not the day after, not ever, in any direct way. This was how the machinery of silence worked. It did not require instruction. It did not require agreement. It simply operated, automatically, as naturally as breathing, because everyone involved had grown up in a world where certain things were understood without being stated, and the most important understanding of all was that a woman who spoke about these things damaged herself far more than she damaged anyone else. In the days that followed, Margaret went about her ordinary life with the appearance of complete normality. She called on acquaintances with Clara. She attended a literary society meeting in Bloomsbury where a gentleman read aloud from a newly published poem. She went to church on Sunday and sat in the pew and listened to the sermon and thought about other things. She ate her meals and wrote her letters and performed every ordinary task with the disciplined competence of a woman who had decided that her outward life would not reflect her inward condition, not because she was dishonest, but because she had no safe place to be honest in. Then a new letter arrived. This one was briefer than the others. Friday evening, 8 o'clock. It did not mention other guests. It did not mention music or dinner or any social pretext at all. It was as bare and direct as a command dressed in the clothes of a request, and it was signed with his first name only, Edmund, which was itself a statement about where things now stood. Margaret sat with this letter for a long time. She thought about the pale woman from the first dinner. She had tried since that evening to find out who the woman was. She had asked 2 of her acquaintances in a roundabout way, describing her physical appearance and mentioning that she had been at the Duke of Ashbourne's dinner, and one acquaintance had gone quiet in a particular way and changed the subject, and the other had simply said she didn't know and moved on. The reaction of the first woman, the going quiet, told Margaret something. She was not sure exactly what, but something. She thought about Frances Hartley from the theatre box. She had seen Frances Hartley once since then, across a room at an afternoon card party, and Frances had met her eye for a moment and then looked deliberately away, and there had been something in that look, some knowledge or some recognition, that Margaret had stored in the part of her mind where she kept things she needed to think about later. She thought about the footman who had been present at the musical evening that was not a musical evening. He was a young man with a very still face who had taken her coat and brought the wine, and then, presumably, spent the rest of the evening somewhere nearby, aware of what was happening in the drawing room, adding it to whatever account of his employer's household he carried in his memory. She thought about what it must be like to be that footman, to know what you knew and to be paid to pretend otherwise. She thought about her own mother, dead 4 years now, who had navigated a similar world with somewhat less grace than Clara, and had ended her life in a rented cottage in Wiltshire, comfortable enough but narrow in all the ways that mattered. She thought about what her mother would say if she were sitting across the breakfast table right now. She thought her mother would probably say something more useful than Clara would say. She thought about all of this, and then she wrote a reply. She said she was not able to attend on Friday. She said she had a prior engagement. She apologized for the inconvenience and hoped another occasion might present itself. She signed it with her full name, which was itself a small assertion, a return to formality, a way of re-establishing a boundary through the medium of a signature. She posted it herself, which was unusual. She did not give it to the housekeeper's boy. There was no reply for 3 days. She did not know whether this was good or bad. On the 4th day, a note arrived, very brief, saying he understood, and that he hoped she was keeping well, and that he looked forward to another occasion when their schedules might align. It was perfectly civil. It was the kind of note that could be read as acceptance or as patience, depending on the disposition of the reader. She was aware that she had not refused, she had only postponed. She was aware of the difference. January moved forward with its grey, cold days and its early dark. London in the winter was a harder city than London in the autumn, less forgiving, more contracted, the parks empty and the streets more purposeful than pleasurable. Clara caught a cold and spent a week largely in bed, which meant the household contracted still further, and Margaret had more time than usual alone with her own thoughts. She used some of that time well. She reread the book on Italian painters, which the Duke had never asked to have returned. She wrote several letters to friends from her earlier life in Wiltshire, women she had grown up with who had married and settled in the country, and whose letters spoke of children and local gossip, and the small manageable pleasures of provincial life. She found herself reading these letters with a longing she had not expected, not for the province exactly, but for the simplicity of the world they described, a world where the stakes of ordinary decisions were lower, where a person knew exactly what they were navigating and why. She also spent some of that time thinking about her situation with a rigor that was new to her, or not new exactly but now more necessary. She had always been a clear thinker. She had just, until recently, been thinking about things that were less immediately consequential. What she arrived at after several days of this was a set of facts arranged as plainly as she could manage. The Duke of Ashbourne was an extremely powerful man who had singled her out for his particular attention. That attention was not, she now understood clearly, purely social or purely courteous. It operated within a framework she had no power to change and no language to challenge directly. She had entered into a situation that had been arranged around her without her full understanding, and she was now inside it, and the question was what she did from this position. She could not undo what had already happened. She understood this. She was not entirely sure even now that she wanted to undo it, and this uncertainty troubled her more than anything else, because it suggested that part of the machinery of these situations was internal to the person being managed by them, that the confusion about your own wishes was itself something that was produced by the situation and then used by it. She was trying to see clearly in a room where the light had been arranged by someone else. What she decided, sitting in Clara's quiet house while Clara coughed upstairs and London shivered outside, was this: she would not go again. She would find reasons, polite and unarguable, for every subsequent invitation. She would maintain the forms of courtesy. She would not create a scene or write an accusatory letter or do anything that could be used against her. She would simply let the distance grow through the ordinary means of absence until the Duke's attention moved elsewhere, which it would do eventually, because it had moved elsewhere before, which was something she now knew without knowing exactly how she had come to know it. This was the plan. It was a reasonable plan. It was the kind of plan that worked, sometimes, for women in similar situations. The difficulty was that it required Clara's cooperation. She went upstairs with a cup of tea and sat on the edge of Clara's bed and looked at her aunt's flushed face against the white pillow and thought about how to begin. Clara was fond of her, she knew. Clara wanted the best for her, in the way that Clara defined best, and Clara had invested her hopes in the situation that was now being reconsidered. The conversation that needed to happen was one that required Margaret to say certain things that Clara had arranged her understanding of the world to avoid hearing. She handed over the tea. She opened her mouth. Clara said, "He sent flowers this morning while you were out. Did you not see them? I had Mary put them in the drawing room." Margaret looked at her. "White roses," Clara said. "Out of season, Lord knows what they cost." Margaret went downstairs. The roses were in a crystal vase on the table by the window, 14 of them, perfectly arranged, cold and beautiful and completely without apology. There was a card tucked among them with 3 words in his handwriting, "Thinking of you." She stood in the doorway and looked at them for a long time. Then she went back upstairs and did not have the conversation she had meant to have with Clara. She brought fresh tea instead. She asked after the cold. She sat in the chair by the window and they talked about nothing consequential for an hour, and the house was warm and quiet, and outside the frost glittered on the iron railings, and the roses stood in their vase, white and impossible and insistent. The plan, as it turned out, required more courage than she had been able to locate that afternoon. She would find it eventually, but not yet. The next letter from the Duke arrived 2 days later. This time she did not refuse. February came, and with it, the particular energy of a city that had spent 3 months in the cold, and was beginning to remember what warmth felt like. The season would begin properly in March, but already the drawing rooms were filling again, the morning calls recommencing, the social machinery warming up with the careful deliberateness of an engine that had been stilled for too long. Clara's cold improved and then departed entirely, and she emerged from her room with renewed determination and a freshly pressed blue morning dress and an agenda. The agenda was, as Margaret had expected, largely concerned with the Duke. "He sent roses," Clara said at breakfast for the 4th time in a week. "White roses out of season, that is not nothing, Margaret." "It is not nothing," Margaret agreed, because this was easier than the alternative. A man does not send white roses out of season to a woman, he is merely being polite too. "I would imagine not." "He intends something serious." Clara paused. She was choosing her words with more care than usual, or at least something settled, something lasting. Margaret understood what the word lasting was standing in for. She said nothing and ate her toast. "He is a widower," Clara added, which was also something she had said before. This was true. The Duchess of Ashbourne had died 8 years previously, and the Duke had not remarried, and there was considerable speculation in certain circles about whether he intended to. He had 2 adult sons from his marriage, both established in their own lives, one in the military and one in the church. There was no obvious obstacle to his marrying again should he wish to. Clara had clearly installed this possibility as the explanation for everything that had been happening, the attention, the letters, the gifts, the private evenings, the flowers. She had arranged it into a story that had a beginning and a middle and a desirable end. Margaret could not make herself believe in this story. Not because it was impossible. In theory it was not impossible. Dukes had married women of modest birth before. Such marriages required enormous social courage and social cost on both sides, and they were not common, but they occurred. The question was not whether it could happen, but whether that was what the Duke was actually proposing, in the language of his particular invitations. And Margaret, who had spent the last 3 months paying close attention to the actual content of the Duke's behavior rather than its most optimistic interpretation, did not believe that it was. She believed something rather different. She believed that what the Duke wanted was what several evenings over the winter had already provided, and what several more evenings might continue to provide, and that this was the extent of his intentions. She believed that what he offered in exchange was a continuation of his interest and his gifts and his attention, which would translate into social elevation as long as the arrangement continued, and that when it ended, as all such arrangements ended, the exchange would terminate and she would be left with whatever position she had managed to secure during its duration. She believed all of this clearly and precisely, and she had been unable, despite several private attempts, to do anything about it. This was the part that was hardest to explain, even to herself. She was not a foolish woman, she was not unaware of her situation. She had thought about it with considerable clarity on multiple occasions, and had arrived each time at the same conclusions, and had then, when the moment came to act on those conclusions, found herself doing the easier thing instead. This was not weakness in the ordinary sense. It was something more complicated, something to do with the way the situation had been constructed around her, the way each small step had been made to seem reasonable, the way the costs of refusal had been made to seem so much higher than the costs of compliance. She had been inside a carefully arranged room for months. The furniture had been positioned so that there was really only one comfortable place to sit. In the second week of February, she attended a dinner at the Duke's house for the 5th time. It was the evening of the 5th dinner that changed something in her, not what happened at the dinner, which was in many ways similar to what had happened before, but what happened afterward. She was in the carriage going home, alone as she had been every time since the first evening, and she reached into her reticule for her handkerchief and found instead a small card that had been slipped there, not by her, at some point during the evening. It was a plain white card with a single sentence written in a hand she did not recognize. She read it once, then again. The sentence said, "You are not the first, there are others. If you want to talk to someone who understands, ask for Mrs. Phillip at the Lending Library on Marchmont Street." She sat with this card in her lap for the rest of the journey. She memorized it. When she arrived home, she went straight to her room and burned it in the candle flame over the wash basin and washed the ash away. Then she sat on the edge of her bed and felt something she had not felt in a long time. She felt very quietly and very certainly that she was not alone. It was the beginning of a different kind of courage, the kind that takes longer to arrive than the sharp, dramatic sort but lasts considerably longer when it does. She did not go to Marchmont Street immediately. She thought about it for 3 days, weighed what it might mean, considered who might have put the card in her reticule and why and whether it was safe. Then on the 4th day she put on her walking clothes and her ordinary bonnet and went out, telling Clara she was going to change her library books, which was true, and walked to Marchmont Street, which was not what she had told Clara she was doing. The Lending Library was a narrow shop between a hat maker and a print seller. She went in and asked for a novel and browsed the shelves for a few minutes, and then asked the woman behind the counter, casually, whether she knew a Mrs. Phillip. The woman looked at her for a moment without expression. "Third table in the reading room," she said, "blue coat." Margaret walked through to the reading room. At the third table in a blue coat sat a woman of about 40 with grey-streaked hair and sharp, observant eyes who did not look up when Margaret entered but said, quietly and without preamble, "Sit down, please. We have some things to discuss." Margaret sat down. Everything changed from that day, though not immediately, and not without considerable pain, and not in any of the ways she had expected. But the silence that had been building inside her since January began, very slowly, to find a shape. Her name was Catherine Phillip, and she had been in London for 11 years, and she knew the Duke of Ashbourne the way a person knows a wound that has healed but left its mark. She did not announce any of this at the third table in the Lending Library on Marchmont Street. She simply began talking, in a low voice, with the unhurried manner of a woman who had rehearsed this conversation in her mind many times before finally having it, and who had decided that the most useful thing she could offer was not sympathy but precision. She told Margaret that she had counted 3 women in the last 6 years who had been in situations similar to what she now understood Margaret's situation to be. One of them had been herself, 7 years ago, when she was younger and less informed about how these things proceeded. She did not describe the details of her own experience. She said only that it had ended the way such arrangements always ended, quickly, with little ceremony, and with consequences that fell entirely on her and not at all on the Duke. She told Margaret what those consequences had looked like for the 3 women she knew of. She did not do this to frighten her. She did it because, she said, a woman who understands what she is facing has at least the possibility of making different choices than a woman who does not. Margaret listened without speaking. She had the feeling of someone who has suspected for months that the map they have been handed is incorrect and is now being shown the actual territory. "He will not offer marriage," Catherine said. She said it quietly as a fact, not a judgment. "I want to be certain you understand that clearly. Whatever has been suggested, whatever interpretation has been put on his attentions by people close to you, he has no intention of marrying you. He has not remarried in 8 years because he has no need to. He has other arrangements. Such as this one, Margaret said. Such as this one and others before it. The pattern does not vary much. Margaret absorbed this, who put the card in my reticule. Catherine looked at her steadily. A woman who works in his household and who has a conscience and a limited capacity to act on it. She can do no more than she has done. It has already cost her something. Margaret thought about the footman with the still face. She thought about all the people in the Duke's world who knew what they knew and could not speak it, and performed their knowledge through small, almost invisible acts of resistance that could not be traced back to them. "What happened to the others?" she asked. "The 3 you know of." "One married, a widower in Somerset, respectable, comfortable. She went there and has been quiet ever since." Catherine paused. "Another left London. I do not know precisely where she is now. She was a proud woman and the ending was not graceful." Another pause, longer this time. "The 3rd I have lost track of. She had family she could go to. I hope she went." The silence between the women held for a moment. "And you?" Margaret said. "I am still here," Catherine said simply. "I found work I was suited for. I found a life that is my own. Took longer than it should have and cost more than it should have, and I had advantages that the others did not, in terms of education and stubbornness." She gave a brief, dry smile that contained several years of her history. "I kept records of what I had experienced. I wrote it down while it was fresh, every detail I could recall, because I understood even at the time that what happened to women in these situations was made easier by the fact that there were no records." He said, she did not say. "It worked in his favor because it always does." "You wrote it down," Margaret repeated. "Everything I could remember, dates, conversations, the names of people who were present, the gifts." She held Margaret's eyes. "I have heard that you are a careful thinker. I have heard that you have a good memory. I am telling you this because it may matter later in ways neither of us can yet predict." Margaret looked down at the table. There was a book lying there that someone had left, face down, the spine creased where it had been held open. She looked at it without seeing it. "Why are you telling me all of this?" she said. "Because no one told me," Catherine said, "and I have spent a considerable number of years being of the opinion that someone should." She left the library shortly after that, walking home through streets she had known for months, but which seemed somehow different now, more specific, more real, as though the conversation she had just had sharpened the resolution of everything around her. She noticed things she had not particularly noticed before. The women selling goods from baskets near the market, the servants moving between houses on private errands, the girls hurrying along the street in pairs with their heads down against the cold. The city was full of women navigating their way through a world that had not been designed with them in mind, and most of them were doing it with considerably fewer resources than she had, and the vast majority of them were doing it in silence. She went home and told Clara she had changed her library books. That evening she found the small notebook she had bought in December and never opened. She sat at her writing desk and opened it, and she picked up her pen, and she began to write. She wrote the date at the top of the first page. Then she wrote the date of the Ellsworth dinner and everything she could remember about it, the other guests, the arrangement of the seating, the conversation, the precise moment when the Duke had first looked at her across the table. She wrote it all in plain language without embellishment or interpretation, the way you would write a report for someone who needed facts. She wrote for 2 hours. Her hand ached when she stopped. She locked the notebook in the drawer of her desk and put the key in the lining of her winter boot. The next morning she rose at her usual time and dressed and came downstairs and behaved in all the ordinary ways expected of her. Clara had received a note from a friend about a forthcoming musical afternoon and was discussing whether it was worth attending. Margaret said she thought it sounded pleasant. They talked about it over breakfast. The housekeeper came in to ask about the week's provisions. The day proceeded as days did. In the late afternoon, when Clara was resting, Margaret went back to the desk and wrote more. She established a method over the following 2 weeks. She would write whenever she was alone for long enough, always in the same notebook, always in the same plain manner. She did not describe her feelings, only her observations. She wrote what was said in conversations as close to verbatim as she could manage. She wrote descriptions of rooms, of people present, of the sequence of events. She noted when other guests had been expected and failed to arrive, and she noted the pattern of this, the way it happened consistently enough to be a system rather than a coincidence. She did not tell anyone she was doing this, not Catherine, whom she met twice more at the library on Marchmont Street, not Clara certainly, not the one or two friends she had in the city who might have been sympathetic. She wrote alone in the late afternoons while the light faded and the city settled into its evening noise outside her window, and the notebook filled with her clear, careful handwriting. In March, a sixth dinner invitation arrived. She sat with it for a whole afternoon. She read it 3 times. She thought about Catherine's account of the women who had come before her, the one who went to Somerset, the one who left London, the one who was lost. She thought about the woman in the blue coat at the third table who had kept her own records and understood precisely why. She thought about what attending would mean and what refusing would mean, and the costs on both sides, and the absence of any option that did not carry costs she had not chosen. Then she thought about something else. She thought about the fact that she had been, for 3 months, inside a situation that she had entered without sufficient information and without genuine freedom of choice, and that the information she now had and the writing she was now doing were the first things in this entire period that were entirely her own. No one had given them to her. No one had arranged them for her. She had found them herself, through her own attention and her own considerable intelligence, and they were hers, locked in a notebook under a key in the lining of her boot. Whatever happened next, that was true. She accepted the 6th dinner invitation. But she went to it differently than she had gone to the others. Not visibly differently, not in any way that anyone watching would have observed. She wore the same kind of dress, and carried the same quiet composure and spoke in the same measured way. But inside herself, she was a different person than the one who had accepted the first invitation in a state of flattery and uncertainty. She was someone who was paying a very specific kind of attention now, the kind that gathers rather than simply receives, the kind that stores and names and eventually uses. The Duke greeted her with his customary warmth. The footman with the still face was at the door. The house was lit and warm. Everything was as it had always been, the same surfaces, the same gracious performance. She shook the Duke's hand and looked him directly in the eye and smiled, and said it was lovely to be back. She was watching everything. Every word, every gesture, every arrangement of the room, every person present, every small signal that told her how this evening had been designed, and what it had been designed to produce. She watched the way he steered the conversation, the way he managed physical proximity, the way the rooms were arranged to produce particular encounters and foreclose others. She watched with the systematic attention of someone constructing a document in their head, adding to the notebook she was not holding, storing everything for the writing that would come later in the quiet of the afternoon. He was charming. He was as charming as he had always been, and he had no idea at all that the young woman sitting across the table from him was making a record of every single thing he did. That asymmetry, she would come to understand, was the first real shift of power she had achieved in the entire course of these months. It was not much, but it was something. And in a situation as constrained as hers had been, something was a great deal more than nothing. Spring came to London with the particular relief of a city that has endured too long a winter. The parks turned green, the long evenings returned, and the social season accelerated into its full and elaborate motion. For a young woman of Margaret's situation and appearance, the season was both an opportunity and a gauntlet. She attended the balls and the assemblies, and the morning calls that Clara arranged with her characteristic energy, and she navigated them all with the composed attention that had always been her best social instrument. But now she was also attending to something else. At every gathering where the Duke's name came up, which was often, because a man of his standing was mentioned at most gatherings of consequence, she listened differently than she had before. She was listening for information, and she was finding more of it than she had expected. People did not speak directly. People in London's upper social world almost never spoke directly about anything that mattered. But they spoke obliquely, in half-sentences and knowing looks and careful changes of subject, and Margaret had always been good at reading those signals, and now she was better at it than she had ever been. She collected fragments. At an afternoon card party in Marylebone, an older woman made a small, dry comment about the Duke's well-known generosity to young ladies, and then caught herself and laughed it off and moved to another topic. At a dinner in Belgravia, she overheard a brief exchange between 2 men, cut short when they noticed her nearby, that contained the name of a woman she did not recognize and a reference to that whole business 2 years ago. At a morning call with a woman whose husband served in Parliament, she caught a moment of something unspoken in the hostess's eyes when the Duke's name was mentioned, a flicker of awareness quickly suppressed. London knew something. London had always known something. The knowing moved through the city in its usual channels, the whispers and the half-statements and the careful silences, the shared understanding that existed in the social air without ever condensing into words that could be cited or challenged. She added all of this to the notebook. In April she met someone who changed the direction of everything, though she did not know it at the time. He was a man named Edward Forsyth, a member of Parliament who sat on a committee concerned with what he described, in the careful language of the era, as matters of personal conduct and public trust. She met him at a dinner given by a mutual acquaintance, a small gathering of 8 people in a house in Bloomsbury, where the conversation ranged broadly and was, unusually for a London dinner party of this period, genuinely substantial. Edward Forsyth was about 40, with an honest, tired face and the earnest manner of a man who had entered politics with ideals and had not yet given them up entirely, though he had clearly spent some years reconsidering them. He was not socially brilliant. He asked the wrong question at the wrong moment twice during dinner and had to be rescued from the resulting silence by the hostess, who was skilled at this. But when he talked about the things he actually cared about, which were to do with accountability and legal protection and the unequal distribution of consequence in English society, he talked with a specificity and a seriousness that Margaret found immediately recognizable. She found herself talking to him after dinner in the way she rarely talked to people at dinner parties, directly and without the usual social performance. "You said earlier that you were interested in the question of testimony," she said, "of what is considered reliable and what is not." "I am very interested in it," he said. "It is a matter that has significant implications for the law as it currently operates, and for who it operates in favor of. What kinds of testimony do you consider most reliable?" He looked at her with the alertness of a man who has heard a question that interests him. "Written records made close to the time of the events they describe," he said. "Detailed, specific, consistent accounts, the kind that do not shift or embellish but hold to what was actually observed." He paused. "Why do you ask?" She looked at him across the small distance of the drawing room. She was not yet ready to say anything more. She was not sure she would ever be ready to say more, in the direct sense, to anyone. "I have been thinking about history," she said, "about what gets recorded and what does not. About who gets to decide." He nodded slowly. "Most of what has been lost from history was lost because someone decided it was better not kept. Inconvenient records have a habit of disappearing." He paused again. "Fortunately, some people are more careful than others about keeping them safe." They did not say anything more substantive than this. The conversation moved to other topics, but before the evening ended, Edward Forsyth gave her his card and said that if she ever wished to discuss these questions further, he was always available to people who had things of genuine interest to discuss. She took the card home. She put it in the notebook, pressed flat between 2 pages. The 7th dinner invitation arrived the following week. It came with a small spray of early spring flowers, violets in a twist of paper, and a note in the Duke's own handwriting that said simply, "I have been thinking about you." She read it standing in the entrance hall, still in her outdoor coat, and she thought about Catherine Phillip and the women before her and the notebook in her desk drawer and Edward Forsyth's card pressed between its pages, and she thought about the woman in the Duke's household who had slipped a plain white card into her reticule and risked her own position to do so. She thought about all of these things, and then she made a decision that was different from every previous decision in this long, complicated, slowly escalating situation. She accepted the 7th dinner, but she also wrote a letter to Catherine Phillip, the first she had sent rather than delivering in person, and she asked Catherine to meet her the following afternoon. There were things that needed to be put in order before Friday. There were things that needed to be said to someone who would understand them and remember them, and, if necessary, corroborate them. She was not sure yet what Friday would bring, but she knew, for the first time since a letter sealed in black wax had arrived on a Tuesday morning in November, that she was no longer entirely without a plan of her own. That mattered, in the world Margaret moved through, in the particular powerless position she occupied. Having a plan of your own was not a small thing. It was, in fact, almost everything. The afternoon before the 7th dinner, Margaret and Catherine Phillip met not at the library on Marchmont Street, but at a small tea-room 2 streets away, a place Catherine chose because it was used primarily by women doing their shopping, and was therefore completely unremarkable. the kind of room where two women having a quiet conversation attracted no attention whatsoever. Margaret brought the notebook. She did not hand it over. She simply set it on the table beside her cup and told Catherine what it contained and how long she had been keeping it and what she intended to do with it, or at least what she was beginning to think she might do with it, which was not entirely the same thing as having decided. Catherine looked at the notebook on the table without touching it. Then she looked at Margaret. "How detailed is it?" she asked. "Very," Margaret said. "Dates, times, the names of everyone present that I could identify, conversations as close to verbatim as I could manage, descriptions of the rooms, the sequence of the evenings, the letter with the gifts, the pattern of the invitations changing over time. Your own account of what occurred." "Yes, sir." "In your own handwriting." "Yes, sir." Catherine was quiet for a moment. Around them, the tea room hummed with the soft noise of women's conversation and the clink of cups and the occasional burst of laughter from a table near the window where four women were sharing a joke about something Margaret couldn't hear. "If you send this account to anyone in authority," Catherine said, "it will be read and then it will be suppressed, and then it will be used as evidence that you are a troublemaker. That is the most likely outcome, and I will not pretend otherwise." "I know that. The Duke's standing is considerable. His connections are throughout every institution that would receive such an account. The law as it currently stands does not offer you much." "I know that too. So why are you telling me this?" Margaret looked at the notebook on the table. "Because you told me that keeping a record mattered. You said it might matter in ways neither of us could yet predict." "I did say that. I am trying to understand what those ways might be." Catherine turned her teacup in its saucer, a slow, deliberate movement. "There are men in Parliament," she said, "who are interested in questions of accountability and unequal consequence. There are committees that deal with matters that would, if you used the correct language and approached the correct people, include a situation such as yours. Such men cannot act directly in any meaningful time frame, but they can receive information. They can incorporate it into a larger picture. They can be in a position, years from now, to say, 'I was told about this, and here is the documentation.'" "Edward Forsyth," Margaret said. Catherine looked at her sharply. "You know him." "I met him at a dinner in Bloomsbury. He gave me his card." A silence settled between them. Catherine seemed to be reassessing something. "He is someone who can be trusted to receive what you have written and keep it safely and do nothing hasty with it," Catherine said at last. "Whether it will ever amount to anything beyond that, I cannot say honestly. But in the world as it is, the choice is often between acting in the certainty that nothing will happen and acting in the hope that something might. The second seems to me more worth doing." Margaret picked up the notebook and put it back in her bag. "I am going to the Duke's dinner tomorrow," she said. Catherine looked at her. "Why?" This was a fair question. Margaret had thought about it carefully, and the answer she had arrived at was one that surprised her slightly with its clarity. "Because I want to be someone who looked at the situation directly, rather than someone who was managed by it without realizing it. If I stop going because I am afraid, I have let the fear arrange my life. If I go because I have chosen to, and I know what I am doing, and I have a record of what has happened, and I know who I would speak to afterward, then I am making a decision, not being swept along by someone else's." Catherine was quiet for a moment, then she said, "That is a very precise distinction. I have had a great deal of time to think." "What do you want to happen at the dinner?" Margaret considered the question. "I want to be fully present and fully aware and fully myself. And if anything happens that goes beyond what I am willing to accept, I intend to say so clearly, in front of whoever is available to hear it." "That is not a small thing to contemplate." "No, it is not." They finished their tea. On the pavement outside, Catherine paused before they parted and said, "Write to me afterward, whatever happens." "I will." "And Margaret," she paused, "be careful, not in the way your aunt means when she says it, in the actual way." Margaret nodded. She walked home through the April afternoon, past the first green of the park trees and the flower sellers with their spring arrangements, and the ordinary busy life of a city that did not know or care about any individual's particular story. She walked with the careful, deliberate pace of someone who is keeping their thoughts from scattering. Friday arrived with mild weather and pale sunshine. She dressed without Clara's assistance, which was unusual, and which Clara noted without commenting on it. She wore a dress that was her own choice, not the grey silk that had become associated in her mind with the earlier evenings, but a darker color, a deep blue that she had owned before coming to London, and that belonged to a version of herself that was slightly more her own than the person who had arrived in November. She put on her own gloves, not the white kid leather pair that the Duke had sent. She took no jewelry except a small brooch that had belonged to her mother. Clara watched her in the hallway and said she looked very well. "Thank you," Margaret said. "Will you be late?" "I don't know yet." "The Duke's carriage." "I am taking a cab," Margaret said. Clara looked at her. Something moved in her expression, some understanding that did not quite reach the surface. She pressed her lips together and then said, "All right." Margaret went out into the mild April evening and hailed a cab and rode to Grosvenor Square in it, watching the streets from the window with the calm, fixed attention of someone who has decided something and is not afraid of what comes next, or is afraid of it but has decided anyway, which is a different thing and a harder one. The Duke's house was lit, as it always was. The footman was at the door. The butler was at the stairs. Everything was in its usual arrangement. She was met in the entrance hall by the Duke himself, which was also usual by now. He took her hands and said she looked beautiful. She thanked him and looked around the entrance hall and said, "Who else is joining us this evening?" "I'm afraid it will be just us tonight," he said, with the same easy manner he always brought to this announcement. She looked at him steadily. "You said in your letter there would be several guests." "Yes, regrettably, everyone else has been prevented." She had expected this. She had known from the moment she accepted the invitation that this was what she would find, because it had been what she found every time, but particularly now, 6 evenings into a pattern that had been growing more direct and less elaborately disguised with each iteration. She had known, and she had come anyway, and standing in the entrance hall of the Duke of Ashbourne's house, she had a decision to make. She had made it 3 days ago in reality. Now she simply had to follow through. She said, "I think I would like to go up to the drawing room and have a cup of tea and talk." He was not disconcerted. He was too practiced for that. He said of course and led her up. In the drawing room he offered wine. She said, "Tea, please." The tea was brought. They sat down. And then Margaret, who had spent months being careful and quiet and socially appropriate and appropriately uncertain, looked across the small tea table at the most powerful man she had ever been in a room with and said, in a clear, even voice, that she would like to have an honest conversation. He lifted his eyebrows slightly. "I should hope all our conversations have been honest." "I would like to have a conversation that is honest in a different way," she said, "about what these evenings have been and what they are not, and what I understand about them now that I did not understand in November." A change crossed his face. It was not dramatic, not the kind of visible shift you would see on an ordinary person's face when they are surprised. It was more like a very small, very controlled adjustment, the way a skilled card player reorganizes their expression between one hand and the next. He looked at her with the particular attention of a man who is suddenly taking something seriously that he had not previously considered serious. "I think," he said, "that you may have arrived at some misunderstandings." "Perhaps," she said. "I would like to discuss them either way." She did not raise her voice. She did not display any dramatic emotion. She was simply present, fully and entirely, and she was speaking in complete sentences, and she was not going to stop. The tea sat between them, cooling, as she began to speak. The drawing room was warm, and the curtains were drawn, and outside on Grosvenor Square the traffic moved, and the city went about its evening business, and knew nothing at all of the woman inside who was, for the first time in 6 months of orchestrated silence, simply speaking the truth in a clear voice to someone who had not expected to hear it. What came next would take months to fully unfold. But this was where it started. Right here, in the cooling tea and the curtained room, with a woman who had decided that silence had served someone else's purposes for long enough. She told him what she knew. She told him that she understood the pattern of these evenings, how the guest list shrank, how the invitations had moved from formal to private, and from private to something else entirely. She told him that she understood this was not a new pattern, that she was aware of other women who had been inside similar arrangements with him, and that those arrangements had ended in a particular way for them and not for him, and that she was no longer willing to proceed as though she did not understand these things. He listened. He was extremely controlled throughout this. She had expected him to be angry or to deny everything or to move into some more direct form of pressure, and he did none of these things. He simply sat and listened with an expression that had gone quite still, and when she finished he said quietly that he had not intended her any distress. She said she was sure he believed that. He said that their evenings had seemed to him to be mutually agreeable. She said that she understood why he had believed that, and that she was explaining to him now why the appearance of agreement and the reality of it were not the same thing, and that she would prefer he receive this information clearly rather than proceed as though it had not been offered. There was a silence. He looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, because she had never before given him a reason to produce it. It was something between reassessment and a kind of careful, professional wariness. "What is it that you want?" he said at last. This was the question she had been expecting. She had thought about how to answer it. "I want to leave this evening without any understanding that I will be returning," she said. "I want there to be no more letters and no more gifts. I want my aunt and myself to be permitted to continue our lives in London without any interference in our social standing or our circumstances." She paused. "And I want you to understand that I have kept a careful record of these past months and that it is in safe keeping with more than one person who knows what to do with it." The last part was not entirely true yet. The record was in her notebook and the notebook was at home in her desk drawer. She had not yet given it to anyone. But she had spoken to Catherine Phillip, and Catherine Phillip knew of its existence, and Edward Forsyth had given her his card, and these things taken together gave her words a solidity they would not otherwise have had. He looked at her for a long moment. "You have been very thorough," he said. "I have had good reason to be." Another silence. He stood up and walked to the window and stood with his back to her, looking out at the dark square below. When he turned back, his expression had completed its adjustment into something very calm and very measured. "I have always admired your intelligence," he said, as though this were a conclusion to something. She said nothing. "I think it would be best if you left," he said, "and I think, as you say, that there should be no further correspondence." She stood up, she set down her teacup, she picked up her reticule, she crossed the room to the door. She had almost reached it when he said from behind her, "You understand that what you have described to me this evening, in terms of documentation, will be evaluated very carefully by people who are very good at their work, if it is ever produced anywhere public." She stopped with her hand on the door frame. She did not turn around. "I imagine so," she said. "I simply want to make sure you have a clear understanding of what you are holding, and what it is worth, and what will happen if you attempt to use it in any way that causes difficulty." She turned around then, because this was the moment that required her to turn around, and she looked at him across the drawing room with the full composure she had carefully maintained throughout the entire evening. "I am sure we both understand each other clearly," she said. "Good night." She went down the stairs. The butler had her coat. The footman opened the door. The cool April air came in from the street, fresh and carrying the smell of damp stone and distant river. The footman with the still face handed her out. As he did, so briefly that she almost thought she had imagined it, he met her eyes and gave the smallest possible nod. Just a dip of the head, barely visible. Just a human being acknowledging another human being who had just done something that required courage. She went out into the April night and walked to the corner where cabs could be found, and she stood there for a moment on the pavement and breathed the cold air and did not cry, because she had decided before the evening began that she was not going to cry, and she was a person who kept the decisions she made with herself. Then she hailed a cab and went home. Clara was waiting in the sitting room, which was unusual. She looked up when Margaret came in and searched her face, and the search lasted about 3 seconds, and then she said nothing about any of it. She simply said, "There is still tea in the pot." Margaret sat down and accepted a cup, and they sat together in the quiet house for a while without speaking, and the fire burned low, and outside London moved through its ordinary Friday night with its ordinary indifference. After a while Margaret said, "I think I am going to write some letters tomorrow." "Oh," said Clara. "Yes, several things that need to be attended to." Clara looked at her. Whatever she saw in her niece's face in that moment, she did not pursue it. She simply said, "All right," in the same tone she had used in the hallway before Margaret left and drank her tea. It was over, that part at least was over. What came next would be something else entirely. What came next would be harder in some ways than anything that had come before, because what came before had happened to her, and what came next she would have to make happen herself, in a world that had been designed at every level to ensure that women in her position made nothing happen at all. She went to bed at 11 and lay in the dark, and listened to the city outside her window and felt, for the first time in months, something that was not quite peace but was close enough to it that she recognized the shape of it. She had done a thing she had not been sure she was capable of doing. She was sure of it now. Tomorrow there were letters to write. Tonight that was enough. The first sign that something had changed came 4 days after the 7th dinner. It was not dramatic. It was the smallest thing in the world, the sort of thing that might have gone unnoticed by someone who was not paying very close attention, which is exactly the sort of person you become when you have been living inside a pressurized situation for 6 months, and have developed a sensitivity to small signals that would seem almost excessive to anyone who had not learned what those signals could mean. Clara received a letter. It came from a woman named Henrietta Drummond, who was one of the 3 or 4 patronesses of their social circle whose approval or disapproval could materially affect their standing in the rooms that mattered. Henrietta Drummond had been, until this point, entirely warm in her dealings with Clara. She had invited them to 2 dinners, had spoken well of them to several mutual acquaintances, and had included them in the guest list for her annual spring ball, which was one of the most coveted invitations available in their particular tier of society. The letter was brief. It said that Mrs. Drummond found herself, with great regret, unable to include Miss Harlowe at the spring ball this year due to an unexpected reduction in numbers. She trusted that Mrs. Ashby would understand and remained, as always, sincerely hers. Clara read it 3 times, then she set it down on the breakfast table and looked at Margaret. Margaret looked back at her. "The Drummond ball," Clara said. "She has withdrawn the invitation." "I read it." "No reason given." Clara's voice was very careful. "A reduction in numbers." "So she says." They sat with this for a moment. The morning light came in through the window. The housekeeper moved somewhere in the back of the house. "Is there something I should know?" Clara said. It was the most directly she had ever asked. Margaret looked at her aunt, at the careful face above the breakfast things, at the woman who had brought her to London and managed her social campaign with such determined energy, and who had not asked questions because not asking questions had seemed, until this moment, like the safest way to proceed. "I will not be attending any further evenings at the Duke of Ashbourne's house," Margaret said. Clara absorbed this. "I see. I am sorry if this creates difficulties." Clara picked up her teacup and set it down again without drinking from it. She was looking at the letter from Henrietta Drummond, not at Margaret. The lines around her mouth had deepened slightly, the way they did when she was thinking something she did not intend to say. "How many evenings were there?" she said. 7. Clara nodded very slowly, as though she were counting something. "Did anyone see you?" she asked. Not what happened, not "Are you all right?" She asked, "Did anyone see you?" Margaret understood this question. It was not cruelty. It was the reflex of a woman who had spent her entire life understanding that visibility was the danger, that what mattered was not what occurred but who could testify to it. It was the only question available to Clara within the system of understanding she had been given, and Margaret did not blame her for it, but it told her everything she needed to know about the particular limits of the help she could expect from that direction. "People were seen going to the house," Margaret said. "A footman would have opened the door, a butler, anyone on the street. I went by cab on the last occasion." Clara closed her eyes briefly. "The Drummond ball is next month," she said. "Yes. Other things will follow, if he has decided to." She stopped. She was not going to complete that sentence. "Yes," Margaret said again. "Other things will follow. What are you going to do?" This was the question that had been occupying Margaret since the Friday evening in the Duke's drawing room. She had lain awake the night of the dinner and the night after, and had thought about it with the systematic clarity she had developed over the winter, and she had arrived at a set of decisions that she had not told anyone about yet. She was going to have to tell Clara, at least in part, because Clara's life was entangled with hers, and Clara deserved to know what was coming. "I am going to write to a man named Edward Forsyth," she said. He is a member of Parliament with a particular interest in the kinds of questions that arise from situations like mine. I am going to send him a copy of certain documentation I have been keeping, and I am going to ask for his guidance on what can be done and what cannot." Clara stared at her, a member of Parliament. "Yes, sir." Margaret, Clara's voice had gone very quiet. "If you do that, if you involve Parliament, if you write anything down officially and put your name to it." "I have already written it down. I have been writing it down since February." The silence that followed was a long one. "Your reputation," Clara said. "I know. Everything we have done this year, everything I have arranged, every connection. I know, Clara, I understand what is at stake. I have understood it for months." "Then how can you?" Clara stopped. She looked at her niece across the breakfast table with an expression that contained, all at once, fear and something else, something harder to identify, something that might have been, underneath the fear, a version of recognition. "How long have you been planning this?" "Since February, approximately. Since I met someone who helped me understand what I was in the middle of." "Who?" "Someone who had been in a similar situation. Someone who was wiser about it than I was." Clara sat back in her chair. She looked, suddenly, older than she usually looked, not old, but aged by the distance between what she had believed about the situation and what it appeared to actually be. "He will deny everything," she said. "I know. He will say you pursued him, that you went willingly, that nothing untoward occurred. I know that too. And they will believe him. They will believe him and not you, because he is who he is and you are who you are, and that is not justice, but it is what is true." Margaret looked at her steadily. "It is probable, yes, but there is a difference between things being recorded and being acted upon. Mr. Forsyth has explained to me, in very clear terms, what I should realistically expect from any formal account I provide. I am not expecting a trial. I am not expecting an apology. I am expecting that someone with some degree of institutional influence will have documentation of what occurred, and that this documentation will exist and be preserved, and that the Duke of Ashbourne will know that it exists, which may or may not affect his future conduct toward women in similar positions." Clara looked at her for a long time. "That is very little," she said. "Yes," Margaret said, "it is very little, but it is what is available." She met with Edward Forsyth the following week. She went to his offices near Westminster on a Tuesday afternoon and brought with her a copy she had made of the notebook, written out in her clearest hand onto a fresh set of pages, covering every evening, every letter, every gift, every conversation, every person present that she could name, every pattern she had observed over the 7 months from November to the spring. Forsyth received it with care. He did not make promises. He told her what he told everyone who brought him documentation of this kind, that the legal system as it currently stood would not provide her with the outcome she deserved, that the institutions of power were arranged in ways that made formal redress for someone in her position close to impossible, and that he would be honest with her about this, rather than encourage her to expect something that was not going to happen. She said she understood this and had come anyway. He looked at the document in his hands, the fair copy of months of careful observation. "This is exceptional," he said. "I mean that in a particular sense, the level of detail, the dates and times. The pattern of it laid out so that it cannot be misread as something other than what it is." "I had good reason to be careful," she said. "You did," he looked up. "I will keep this safely. I will add it to a record I have been building on this particular matter, which includes accounts from at least 2 other sources that I am not at liberty to name. I cannot tell you when or whether this will be used in any way that produces visible results. The honest answer is that it may not produce visible results within your lifetime or mine." Margaret nodded. "But it will exist," he said, "and I have found in this work that existence matters. Things that exist can be found. Things that have been written down cannot be entirely unwrote. And sometimes the most important thing a person can do is simply ensure that what happened was recorded by someone who was there." She took the cab back to Gloucester Street in the mild afternoon sunshine and sat in the back of it and watched the streets go by and thought about what he had said. Things that have been written down cannot be entirely unwrote. She thought about the footman with the still face. She thought about the woman in the blue coat in the lending library. She thought about Catherine Phillip and the women before her and the particular long, expensive, unrewarded work of keeping records in a world that preferred them not kept. She thought about the fact that she was 23 years old and she had done something difficult, and done it without assistance, and done it with more clarity and more courage than the situation had originally seemed to invite, and that this was true regardless of what came next, regardless of whether the Drummond ball was the first of many closed doors or the last. She could not know yet what would come next. What came next was worse than she had hoped and better than she had feared, and entirely consistent with the world she lived in, which was a world that protected powerful men as a matter of institutional habit, and offered women in her position very little beyond the dignity of their own clear-headedness. She would need all of hers. She already had it. She had had it from the beginning, which was possibly the most important thing about the entire story. She had simply needed the right conditions to use it. And now, for better or for worse, the conditions had arrived. The weeks that followed the meeting with Forsyth were the most socially uncomfortable of Margaret's time in London, though she carried them with a composure that she had to choose deliberately each morning, the way you choose clothing, because the alternative was to be visible in a way that would cost her more than composure already was. Invitations stopped, not all at once, not in a way that could be traced clearly to a single cause. They simply began to thin, the way light thins in late afternoon, gradually and then all at once. A card party that they had expected to be included in passed without an invitation. A dinner that Clara had heard spoken of at a morning call was mentioned to her afterward as having gone very well, as though she had already been assumed absent. 3 women who had previously called on them with some regularity began calling with less. Clara bore all of this with her jaw set and her back straight, and her opinions on the matter unexpressed in words, though they were visible in her face to anyone who knew her well. She continued to make morning calls and to attend the events they were still included in, and she behaved at each of them with the particular bright sociability of a woman who is refusing to acknowledge a siege. She did not refer to the Duke, not once, after the morning of the Drummond letter. She behaved in all public ways as though the matter did not exist. She was remarkable, Margaret thought, in her own way, remarkable in the specifically English upper-class manner, which required you to perform absolute normality under conditions of quite considerable difficulty. Margaret performed normality too, but she was also doing other things. She was writing, every day, sometimes for an hour, sometimes for longer if the house was quiet. She had started a second notebook when the first was full, and this one was not only a record of the past but a record of the present. The Drummond ball withdrawal, the other invitations that had not come, the morning call where a woman she had known for 4 months looked through her as though she had become invisible. She was writing it all down because Forsyth had said that things which have been written cannot be entirely unwrote, and she had found this to be a comfort that was not easily explained but was very real. She wrote to Catherine Phillip every 2 weeks, short letters that contained only what was strictly necessary and nothing that could be incriminating if read by anyone other than the intended recipient. Catherine wrote back with similar brevity. They had developed a kind of shorthand that allowed them to say more than the words actually said, a skill that women in their position had been developing and passing to one another for generations. One morning in May, she received a letter from an unexpected source. It was from a woman she had met only once, at a dinner in the autumn, a woman named Alice Whitmore who had been a peripheral acquaintance at best, someone she had spoken to briefly over a dessert course and had not seen since. The letter was careful and slightly formal, the kind of letter you write when you are not entirely sure whether you are doing the right thing in writing it but have decided to do it anyway. Alice Whitmore said that she had heard, through channels she preferred not to specify, that Margaret was someone who might understand her situation. She said that she had been in a situation she found difficult to describe in a letter, involving a person she did not name, and that she would very much value the chance to speak with someone who might know what she meant without requiring her to be entirely explicit. She was sorry if this was presumptuous. She remained with respect. Margaret read this letter twice, and then sat for a moment with it in her hands, and thought about the plain white card slipped into her reticule at the 5th dinner, and about the woman in the blue coat at the 3rd table of the lending library who had begun a conversation that had changed the course of her winter. She thought about what it had meant to her to walk through that door on Marchmont Street and find someone who said without preamble, "Sit down, we have things to discuss." She wrote back to Alice Whitmore that afternoon. She suggested they meet for tea. Alice was 26, a clergyman's daughter from Shropshire who had come to London to stay with her married sister, and she had been in her situation, as she called it, for 4 months. She was not the only one, Margaret understood. There would be others she did not know about, women at varying points in varying versions of this particular kind of story, women who were carrying their situations in silence because there was nowhere to carry them that did not involve a cost they could not afford. She could not fix any of this. She was 23 years old with no money, no formal authority, and a rapidly diminishing social position. She could not fix it in any large or public way, but she could sit in a tea room and be someone who said, "I understand what you mean, and you are not alone, and here is what I know." She became, over the course of that spring and summer, someone who did that. She met 3 other women through Catherine's network and through her own careful inquiries. She sat with each of them and listened. She did not minimize what they were dealing with or inflate what she could offer. She told them about the notebook. She told them about Forsyth. She told them what Catherine had told her, which was that keeping records mattered in ways that were not always immediately visible. Her own social life contracted further through May and into June. Clara stopped mentioning invitations that had not arrived. There was an unspoken agreement between them that the season as they had planned it had become something else, and that surviving what it had become required a different set of priorities than the ones they had arrived with. In July, something happened that neither of them had anticipated. A letter came for Clara from a solicitor's office on Gray's Inn Road. It was concerning, the letter said, certain matters of a financial nature affecting Mrs. Ashby's modest investments, and it requested a meeting at the earliest convenience. Clara went to the meeting alone, as was her habit in financial matters, and returned 2 hours later looking as though she had aged by several years. The nature of the problem was not, in the end, a financial one. It was a communication, delivered through the intermediary of a legal firm, that concerned the particular way in which Clara's investments were structured, and the vulnerability of that structure to certain pressures that need not be made explicit if matters in general were arranged in a manner that was, the solicitor had said with professional delicacy, mutually convenient. Margaret listened to this account with absolute stillness. "He is threatening us," she said. "Not in any way that could be put in a letter," Clara said. "Not in any way that could be challenged or cited. Simply in the ordinary way that people with very large amounts of power communicate to people with very small amounts of it." This was the shape of it then. The pressure applied through the removal of invitations had not produced the desired result, because Margaret had not broken, had not retreated, had not written a letter of apology or behaved in any way that indicated she had decided that the cost of her position was too high. And so the mechanism had moved to something larger, something that touched not only her but Clara, who had done nothing except be her aunt and hope for something better than what they had found. Margaret sat with this for the rest of the evening. She thought very carefully. She thought about Forsyth and about the documentation he held. She thought about what he had said about visibility and record-keeping. And she thought about the fact that the Duke, in applying this particular pressure at this particular moment, had made a specific error, which was to underestimate how much documentation she had produced and how many people now held copies of it. She did not panic. She wrote to Forsyth that night, a longer letter than she had written before, describing what had happened and what she believed it meant, and what she was asking him to consider doing with the material she had provided. She sealed the letter herself. She posted it herself the next morning before Clara was awake. Then she went back to the house and made tea, and when Clara came downstairs she said, "We are going to be all right," in a tone that was not a reassurance but a statement of intention. Clara looked at her for a moment. "You sound very certain," she said. "I am not entirely certain," Margaret said, "but I am determined, which is usually a more useful quality." Clara sat down and accepted her tea, and looked at her niece across the breakfast table with an expression that was, finally, something closer to recognition than anything else. "Your mother," she said, "would have liked who you have become." Margaret looked at her. She did not say anything. But she felt, in the quiet morning kitchen, the particular warmth of being seen by someone who had been too afraid to look for a very long time. Outside, London was waking up. Summer light lay on the street. Somewhere a market was starting. The ordinary morning business of the city moved forward as it always did, indifferent and relentless, without any knowledge of the women sitting in the kitchen on Gloucester Street, or the letters that had been written, or the notebooks that had been filled, or the small, difficult, completely undramatic courage that it had taken to do all of it. But the letters existed, the notebooks existed, the copies in Forsyth's office existed, The women who had sat in tea rooms and listened existed. They all existed. They could not be made not to exist. That, in the end, was the only weapon anyone in their position had ever had. And Margaret had used it. Edward Forsyth worked slowly, and he worked quietly, and he worked with the particular patience of a man who had learned, over many years in Parliament, that the loudest approaches to difficult problems were almost never the most effective ones. He received Margaret's letter about the financial pressure being applied to Clara's investments, and he read it twice and made notes in the margins, and then put it in a file that he kept in a locked drawer in his office near Westminster. He had 3 other files in that drawer, each relating to a different person, each concerning aspects of the same larger pattern, each built from the kind of detailed first-hand accounts that he had spent years trying to collect from people who were, for entirely understandable reasons, reluctant to provide them. He wrote back to Margaret within the week. His letter was careful, calibrated, written in the language of a man who understood that what he said could be read by other eyes. He said that he had noted what she reported with considerable interest, and that he intended to discuss certain matters with 2 colleagues whose positions would make their involvement useful. He said that she should continue to keep records of any communications or events that she considered relevant. He said that he expected it would take time, and that she should not interpret the absence of immediate visible movement as the absence of work being done. She read this letter at the kitchen table on Gloucester Street and understood precisely what it did and did not promise. It promised nothing immediate. It promised careful, patient, institutional work that might or might not produce any results she would live to see. She folded the letter and put it in the second notebook, and she got up and washed her cup and went about her day. What Forsyth was actually doing, which Margaret did not know the full extent of until much later, was this. He had taken her account and the accounts he held from 2 other women and had begun, through his position on a particular parliamentary committee, to raise certain questions in the language of administrative inquiry rather than personal complaint. He had asked questions about the management of household finances and the mechanisms by which people in positions of social and financial power exerted influence over the arrangements of those less powerful. He had raised these questions obliquely, in the context of broader discussions about legal reform, in a way that could not be directly connected to any specific individual, but that planted certain ideas in the minds of certain people who would, eventually, think about them. This was slow work. It was unglamorous work. It produced nothing that would appear in any newspaper or be spoken of at any dinner table. It did not vindicate Margaret. It did not challenge the Duke. It was simply the kind of patient, procedural work by which large institutions are occasionally, very slowly, moved. Margaret, in the meantime, was making her own arrangements. By July she had understood that the London she had arrived in with Clara in September of the previous year, the London of dinners and morning calls and the careful construction of a social position, was no longer available to her in the form she had known it. Some doors were closed, more would close. The Duke had resources she did not, connections she did not, and the simple advantage of being believed by default in every room she was not, which was most of them. She had to decide what to do with the life she had, not the life she had planned to have. She spent a week making this decision, which involved a great deal of quiet walking in the parks, and a certain amount of writing in the notebooks that was not a record of events, but rather something more personal, something closer to a private argument with herself about what she actually wanted, and what she actually believed, and what she was actually capable of. It was, she thought, the first genuinely honest writing she had done since she arrived in London, the first writing that was not in service of an account or a strategy, but simply her own attempt to understand herself. She made 2 decisions. The first was that she would return to Wiltshire by the end of the summer. Not in retreat, not in defeat, but because London in its current form was not somewhere she could do the things she wanted to do, and Wiltshire was a place she understood, and where she had connections that did not depend on the Duke's goodwill or the social favor of Henrietta Drummond. She had a friend from her childhood there, a woman named Eleanor Cross, who had married a solicitor and lived in a comfortable house in Salisbury, and who had always been practical and kind, and who had written to Margaret twice that spring with what she had described as a standing invitation. The second decision was harder to name but clearer in her mind. She intended, for as long as she was able, to be the person who sat at the 3rd table in the tea room. She intended to be available, carefully and quietly and through whatever network she could maintain, to women who were in situations similar to hers. Not as a formal arrangement, not in any way that could be cited or challenged. Simply as a person who knew something useful and was willing to share it, and who understood that keeping records and keeping connections were the two most effective things that ordinary people without institutional power could do in the face of institutional power that was used badly. She told Catherine Phillip about her intention to go to Wiltshire. They met at the tea room near Marchmont Street on a Wednesday afternoon in late July. Catherine listened without interrupting, and then said that she thought it was the right decision, and that she would maintain what she described as their correspondence, which was the word they both used to refer to the network of information and support that had grown quietly between them and the women they knew. Alice Whitmore has found her feet somewhat, Catherine said. She has moved to a different neighborhood. Her sister has been supportive. I'm glad, Margaret said. There is a woman in Birmingham who wrote to me last month through a mutual connection. A different man, a different city, the same shape of situation. She needs someone to talk to. Send her my address in Wiltshire, Margaret said. Once I have settled, I will write to her. Catherine looked at her across the table with the particular expression that she sometimes had, a look that was not quite maternal and not quite collegial, but occupied the territory between the two. You are building something, she said. I am trying to build something very small, Margaret said. I am trying to build the kind of thing that does not show. That is the only kind that lasts. She began packing in the second week of August. The house on Gloucester Street had been taken furnished, so there was not much to pack. Her own things fit into 4 trunks. The notebooks went in the smallest one, wrapped in a length of oilcloth to protect them from damp, tucked beneath 2 winter dresses. The key to the trunk went on the same chain as her mother's brooch, around her neck. Clara was quieter than usual during the packing days. She helped where help was asked for and sat in the kitchen in the evenings drinking tea and looking out the window with the expression of a woman recalibrating something. They had several conversations that were not entirely about practical matters, conversations that moved toward and then away from the things that had happened, stopping just short of full examination, but going further than they had ever gone before. One evening, 2 days before they were due to leave, Clara said, I want to apologize to you. Margaret looked up from the trunk she was organizing. I want to apologize, Clara said again more precisely, for not asking you the right questions. At the beginning, when I should have. I was thinking about other things and I did not ask you the questions a person should ask when they care about someone who is in a situation they do not fully understand. Margaret sat down on the edge of the bed. You did not know what questions to ask, she said. I did not know, Clara agreed, because I did not want to know. There is a difference and I am aware of it. Yes, I am sorry. I know, Margaret said. They did not say very much more about it. But the apology was real and it had been offered without any qualification and Margaret received it in the same spirit. And when they said good night, there was something different in the quality of the air between them, something that had been strained for months and had now, by this small exchange, been eased. The night before they left London, Margaret went for a walk. She walked without any particular destination, through the streets she had learned over the past year, past the park and the market and the library and the tea room on the street near Marchmont Street. London in the August evening was warm and full and entirely itself, enormous and indifferent and buzzing with its own life. She walked for about an hour. On her way back she passed through Grosvenor Square. She did not plan to go past the Duke's house, but she went past it in the soft summer evening and she looked at it. All the windows were lit. There was a carriage at the door. Some gathering was proceeding inside, some dinner or card party or musical evening, and the house was bright and alive and entirely unchanged, because things that happen to women in rooms like the ones inside that house do not change the house. She stood on the pavement opposite and looked at it for perhaps 30 seconds. Then she turned and walked home. She slept well that night, which was something she had not always been able to say over the past many months. She slept without difficulty, in the nearly empty room above the Gloucester Street house, and in the morning she rose before Clara and made tea and sat at the kitchen table while the summer light came in through the window, and she thought about Wiltshire and Eleanor Cross and the woman in Birmingham and the notebooks in the oilcloth wrapping in the trunk upstairs, and she felt, carefully and without drama, something that was not a conclusion but was the beginning of the next thing. Whatever that was going to be, she was going to find out. Eleanor Cross met them at the coaching inn in Salisbury with a hired cart for the trunks, and the warm, uncomplicated welcome of a woman who had genuinely meant her invitation, and was pleased to see it accepted. She was a tall, fair woman with a steady manner and a laugh that arrived at unexpected moments and improved whatever it landed on. Her husband, a solicitor named Geoffrey Cross, was thoughtful and quiet, and had the useful quality of not requiring conversation unless there was something worth saying. Margaret had known Alina since they were children, sharing a schoolroom in the village outside Marlborough, where they had both grown up. Alina had married at 19, contentedly and practically, and had built a life in Salisbury that was smaller than what she might have had in other circumstances, but entirely her own, which she regarded as a considerable advantage. She had 3 children, a busy household, a garden she tended with serious attention, and a group of female friends in the town who met every Thursday to discuss books and the state of the world, both of which they treated with equal seriousness. Margaret settled into the spare bedroom in Alina's house and spent the first week in the kind of recovery that is not dramatic but requires time, the slow return to ordinary human rhythms after a period of sustained tension. She slept, she helped in the garden, she ate regular meals at a proper table with other people who were not performing anything in particular. She played with Alina's youngest child, a girl of 4 who had strong opinions about the correct order of activities and expressed them without ambiguity. She read novels in the evenings, not for information or strategy, but simply because they were stories, and she had not read simply for pleasure in a very long time. At the end of the first week, she got out the notebooks. She had not opened them since packing them in the oilcloth. She brought them out in the afternoon while Alina was occupied with the children and Geoffrey was at his office, and she sat at the small desk in her room and opened the first one and read through what she had written from November onward. She read it all the way through without stopping, taking about 2 hours, reading it the way you read something that was written by a person you know but have not seen in some time, noting both the familiarity and the distance. What she read surprised her slightly in a particular way. The account was even cleaner than she had remembered it. The person who had written it had been frightened and confused and working under considerable pressure, but the writing itself did not show these things. It was precise and specific and completely without hysteria, a plain account of plain facts arranged in chronological order, the kind of document that said, "This is what happened and this is how I know and here is the evidence." She had written something genuinely good. In the circumstances, with everything pressing against her, she had produced something that was actually useful. She wrote to Forsyth from Wiltshire that week, giving him her new address. She wrote to Catherine Phillip. She wrote a long letter to the woman in Birmingham, which was the first time she had written to someone in that situation with whom she had not yet spoken in person, and she found that she was able to do it clearly and well, that she knew what to say and what not to say, that she had developed, without planning to, a vocabulary for these situations that was precise enough to be useful without being so specific that it could cause harm if read by the wrong person. Catherine wrote back within 2 weeks. The Duke, she said, had recently been seen publicly with a young woman at a theatre engagement. The woman was about 20 years old and had come to London in the autumn from a family in the north. Margaret read this and set it down and felt something that was not entirely grief and not entirely anger, but occupied the complicated territory between the two. She sat with it for a while. Then she picked up her pen and wrote a letter to Catherine asking for any additional information about the young woman's name and circumstances, and she began thinking about whether there was any discreet way to ensure that what had happened in the tea room on Marchmont Street might happen again for someone who clearly needed it. This was not heroism. She was very clear in her own mind about that. It was not a crusade or a mission or anything with a grand name. It was simply the practical work of a woman who had acquired some useful information in a hard way, and who believed that information should be shared with people who needed it, because the cost of not sharing it was higher than the cost of sharing it. Geoffrey Cross, who had learned the broad outlines of the situation from Alina over the course of several evening conversations that Margaret had not been present for, but had implicitly consented to by telling Alina enough to make the broad outlines available, came to Margaret one Sunday afternoon after church and sat down with her in the garden, and said that he thought what she was doing, in terms of the documentation she had kept and the connection she maintained with Forsyth, was the right thing, and that if there was ever a legal dimension to it, a dimension in which a solicitor's assistance might be useful, she should consider him available. She thanked him and meant it. "You may not need me," he said. "Forsyth is well connected and knows what he is doing." but situations sometimes develop in directions that were not anticipated, and it is useful to know that you have someone local who can act quickly if necessary. "It is very useful," she said. "Thank you." She lived in Alina's spare bedroom for 3 months, which was longer than she had planned and shorter than she needed. In October, she found a small rented cottage in a village 6 miles from Salisbury, within easy distance of Alina and Geoffrey and the community she had begun to build there. Clara went back to London eventually, quietly, through the careful work of a mutual friend who helped her rebuild her social position one careful step at a time. It was slow and it cost Clara something, and they both knew it, but Clara was resilient in the particular English way of women who have been shaped by difficulty and have decided that difficulty is survivable. They wrote to each other regularly. Their letters were warm, more honest than their speech had ever managed to be, and contained, on both sides, things that had needed saying for a long time and had simply been waiting for the right form. The Duke of Ashbourne continued in his London life largely undisturbed, as everyone had known he would. He attended Parliament. He received guests. His properties continued to produce their considerable income. His name continued to appear in the newspapers in connection with political matters and occasionally in the social columns. He was, to all public appearances, exactly what he had always been. But in Forsyth's locked drawer near Westminster, the file continued to grow. In the spare room of Margaret's cottage in Wiltshire, the notebooks were joined by new ones. In the network of careful letters that moved between Marchmont Street and Salisbury, and eventually Birmingham and 2 other cities whose names came later, something continued that had no name yet and no public face and no institutional standing. Something continued. That was not nothing. In fact, as Margaret had learned over the course of a very long and very difficult year, it was quite a great deal. Things that continue, in the face of everything designed to stop them, eventually become impossible to ignore. Not immediately, not quickly, not in the time that would feel satisfying, but eventually. And she intended to be here for eventually, with everything she had written and everything she knew, every word in every notebook, every letter sent and received, every cup of tea in every quiet room where a woman had sat down and not been alone. She was 24 now. She had her whole life. She intended to use it. The parliamentary inquiry that Edward Forsyth had been building toward for over a year was convened in the early months of 1814, and it was not called by any name that would have indicated its true subject to anyone reading the notice in the official journals. It was referred to as an inquiry into matters of personal conduct and fiduciary responsibility among persons holding public trust, which was the kind of language that said everything to people who needed to know and nothing at all to people who would have used the knowledge badly. Forsyth sat on the committee. He had arranged for 2 other men to sit on it as well, men he trusted, men whose politics aligned with his, and whose institutional positions gave them the authority to receive certain kinds of testimony and certain kinds of documentation, without being required to dismiss them on procedural grounds. The inquiry ran for 6 weeks, conducted in rooms that were not open to the press, receiving information from sources that were recorded in its official minutes by reference number rather than name. Margaret's account, the fair copy she had delivered to Forsyth's offices the previous spring, was entered into the record as submission 4. She was not asked to appear in person. She was not identified by name. She was simply present in the inquiry as a set of detailed, dated, specific observations that contradicted nothing and corroborated a great deal. She knew this was happening because Forsyth wrote to her and told her, with his characteristic measured care, what he could tell her and not more. She read his letter in the morning light in her cottage in Wiltshire, and then looked out the window at the garden, which was still winter bare but beginning to show the first tentative signs of what spring would bring. She had understood from the beginning that the inquiry would not produce a verdict. It was not a trial. It was not capable of being a trial, given what the law was and what it was not, and Forsyth had been honest about this from the first conversation she had had with him. What it could produce was something different and in some ways more durable, a formal institutional record, however carefully worded, however hedged, that acknowledged, in writing, within the language of the official system, that certain patterns of behavior had occurred and had been observed, and had had consequences for specific individuals whose welfare had not been considered. This is not justice. It is not what should have happened. But it was what was possible in 1814, and Forsyth was using what was possible with care and seriousness. The inquiry's final report, when it was produced in the spring of 1814, ran to 47 pages and said, in the restrained and qualified and elaborately nonspecific language of official documents, that certain conduct had come to the committee's attention that gave rise to concern about the use of social and financial influence by individuals in positions of power and trust. It recommended that the relevant legal statutes be reviewed with attention to the protection of persons in positions of social vulnerability. It was received by Parliament, filed in the appropriate place, and did not generate any immediate legislative action. But it existed, 47 pages of it in the official record, filed under a reference that could be found by anyone who knew what to look for. Forsyth sent her a copy. She read it on a Tuesday evening in April, sitting in the chair by the window in her cottage while the spring light faded outside and the first tentative warmth of the season came through the glass. She read it carefully and completely, including the sections that were most hedged and most procedurally cautious. When she finished, she set it down on the table and sat with it for a while. She thought about the November morning when the letter sealed in black wax had arrived on the floor of the house on Gloucester Street, and she had turned it over twice before opening it. She thought about the white gloves and the Italian painting and the dinners where the guest list shrank. She thought about the footman with the still face and the woman in the blue coat and Catherine Phillips' voice in the lending library. "Sit down, we have things to discuss." She thought about the plain white card slipped into her reticule, the woman in the Duke's household who had taken a risk so small it could not be traced, but had cost her something nonetheless, had cost her the daily management of her own conscience in the service of someone else's comfort. She thought about the 47 pages on the table in front of her and what they contained, which was not very much but was more than nothing, and what they would mean in 5 years or 10 years or 50 years or never, which was a range she could not collapse, and which she had learned to hold without it destroying her sense of purpose. Then she picked up her pen and wrote to Forsyth and thanked him for the copy, and for everything he had done, which was more than she had expected and less than she had needed, and exactly what had been possible. His reply came 10 days later. He thanked her for the account she had provided, which he said was the most precise and methodically sound documentation he had received in the course of the inquiry. He said that it had been of genuine assistance and that he was glad she had kept it. He said that he hoped she was well and that her new circumstances suited her. He also said in the last paragraph that the young woman he had heard of from the north, who had been seen with the Duke the previous autumn, had recently left London and returned to her family. He did not say more than this. He did not need to. Margaret read this last paragraph and sat with it for a long time. Then she got up and went out into the garden, which was beginning properly now, the first real warmth of the year on her face, the soil dark and busy with whatever it was doing in the April light. She stood in the garden for a while and looked at the countryside spreading out past the garden wall, the long familiar view of Wiltshire that she had grown up with and left and returned to, and she breathed the spring air and felt the sun on her skin, and did not say anything to anyone because there was no one there to say anything to. In May she received a letter from the young woman from the north. It had come through Catherine Phillip, who had arranged the connection carefully, and it was written in a careful, tense hand, the kind of handwriting that belongs to someone writing something they are not sure they should be writing. It asked, without saying exactly what it was asking, whether there was someone who might understand a situation that the writer was having difficulty explaining to people who had not been in anything like it. Margaret wrote back immediately. She gave her address. She said, "Write to me directly, I will understand." It was the beginning of a correspondence that lasted 18 months and involved, on Margaret's side, some of the most careful and useful writing she had ever done. She called upon everything she had learned, from Catherine and from Forsyth and from her own long months of attention and record-keeping, to give the young woman from the north the information and the perspective that no one had thought to give Margaret until it was later than it should have been. She could not repair what had happened. She could not change what the world was or how it was arranged, but she could be the person who sat at the third table. She was getting better at it. Eleanor Cross, who understood more of the situation than she was ever directly told, came to the cottage one afternoon in early summer and sat in the garden with Margaret over a pot of tea and said, after a while, "You are doing something important. I want you to know I think so, even though I can't quite say what it is." It is very small, Margaret said. Most important things are, Elinor said, until they aren't anymore. Margaret considered this. Outside the garden wall, the countryside was very green, and the sky above it was the particular English blue that exists only in early summer and feels like a kind of promise that may or may not be kept. A bird was singing somewhere in the hedge. The tea was getting cold. I keep thinking about the ones I can't reach, Margaret said. The ones who don't know there is anyone to reach. The ones whose situation has already resolved itself in the worst direction before anyone thought to slip a card into their reticule. You can't reach everyone, Elinor said. Nobody can. No, but you can reach the ones you reach. Margaret looked at her. That's a very simple thing to say. It is, Elinor said. And it took me approximately 4 decades to genuinely believe it, so I think it qualifies as wisdom. Margaret laughed. It came out more freely than laughter had come for a while, more genuinely, without the effort that laughter had required for much of the previous year. She laughed and Elinor laughed and the bird in the hedge continued its indifferent singing, and the tea went completely cold and neither of them made any move to go inside. It was a good afternoon. There were going to be more of them, that at least she knew. In the evening she wrote a letter to Catherine Phillip, and then one to a woman in Bristol whose name had come to her through a different channel, a woman who was in the early stages of a situation that had the particular shape that Margaret now recognized from all her experience and all her reading and all the notebooks she had kept. She wrote both letters with the careful, clear attention that she had spent the last year developing. Then she put them aside to be posted in the morning, and she made herself supper and ate it by the window in the last light of the June evening, and listened to the sounds of the countryside settling into the dark and felt, beneath the ordinary surface of a quiet evening in a small cottage, the specific and not entirely comfortable feeling of someone who is doing the work they are supposed to be doing. Even when that work is difficult and slow and produces results that are not always visible and is done largely in private and without any recognition from any source that matters to anyone except the people directly involved. It was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. She had a pen and she had paper, and she had the clear, methodical intelligence she had been born with and had spent a hard year learning how to use in the service of something worth using it for. Outside, the last light faded. Inside, the lamp burned on the table beside the notebooks and the letters, and the copy of the parliamentary report that she had read twice and filed carefully in the trunk with the oilcloth wrapping. The city of London was many miles to the east, going about its evening business without any particular awareness of her or her cottage or her notebooks or her careful letters. The Duke of Ashbourne was presumably in Grosvenor Square or one of his country properties, proceeding with his life in the way that men of his standing proceeded with their lives, undisturbed by inquiry reports written in careful language and filed in places that most people never looked. But the report was there, the notebooks were here, the letters were in the post tomorrow. And somewhere in the north of England, a young woman was reading a letter that said, "Write to me directly, I will understand." That was all. That was enough. Summer turned to autumn in Wiltshire with its usual unhurried motion, the long light shortening, the garden passing through its harvest and into its end-of-year quiet. Margaret settled more deeply into the cottage and the life around it. She walked every morning on the long roads between the fields and used that time to think, the way she had always used solitude to think methodically and without distraction. She had come to understand that solitude, which she had sometimes feared as a younger woman because of what it might lead to, was in fact her most useful environment, the place where her thinking was clearest and her judgment most reliable. The letters continued, more of them now, from a larger and more dispersed group of women who had found her through Catherine's network, and through the careful referral system that had grown up without anyone designing it, simply as a natural consequence of people telling each other about a woman in Wiltshire who understood certain situations and could be written to. She answered every letter within a week. She kept copies of the ones she sent. She kept files of the ones she received, organized by date and referenced by number rather than name, the way Forsyth organized things, because she had learned from him that the organization of information was itself a form of care for the people who had provided it. She also began, in a small and careful way, to write something that was not a letter and not a record of her own experience but something she thought of as a guide, though she did not call it that aloud to anyone. It was a short document, perhaps 15 pages in its first form, setting out in plain language what a woman in a certain kind of situation might find useful to know, what records to keep and how, what questions to ask and of whom, what to expect from the various people and institutions that were nominally available to her, and what to expect that they would not be able to provide, and how to hold all of this without it becoming the kind of despair that prevented action. She showed it first to Alina, who read it carefully and then said that it was the most practically useful thing she had read on the subject, and that she wished it had existed 10 years ago, and that it should be made available to more people than Margaret could reach by letter. How, Margaret said. Print it, Alina said. Margaret looked at her. Not under your name, Alina said. Not attached to any specific situation, just as a practical document, something that could be left in the right places, given to the right people. Margaret thought about this for a long time over several days. She talked to Geoffrey Cross about the practical aspects of such a thing, the printing, the distribution, the question of legal exposure. Geoffrey, with his solicitor's careful attention to what was and was not defensible, advised her on how to write certain sections and suggested removing 2 passages that were too specifically traceable. She revised accordingly. In November, a small number of copies of what she had written were printed at a press in Salisbury that Geoffrey knew and trusted. They had no author's name and no title, only a brief heading that said, "For the use of those who may find it useful." They were distributed quietly, through the network of women that had been built over the preceding year and a half, and through Forsyth, who passed several copies through his own channels to people he thought should have them. She did not know how many copies were eventually made. She did not know how many women read what she had written. She would never know entirely the shape of what the document became or did not become. But Catherine Phillip wrote to her in December to say that she had given a copy to 6 women she knew, and that 2 of them had written to her immediately asking for the address of the woman in Wiltshire, and that the words most commonly used in those letters were, "I thought I was alone." Margaret read this in the cold December morning in her cottage, and felt something that she could not entirely name, but that had to do with the particular feeling of having built something that was larger than any individual piece of it, something that exceeded what any one person could have constructed by themselves, and required the presence and the courage of all the people who had contributed to it. The footman with the still face and the woman in the lending library, and Catherine Phillip and Alice Whitmore, and Alina Cross and Geoffrey Cross and Edward Forsyth, and all the women who had written letters and kept records and sat at third tables in tea rooms and passed information in careful language to people who needed it. She had not built this alone. She had simply been one of the people who had helped build it, at a particular moment when her specific situation and her specific capabilities had made her useful. This was how things got built in the world as it was, in the margins, in the spaces that the official structures did not reach, by people who were not credited and were not celebrated, and were working in conditions of considerable difficulty with very limited resources toward outcomes that were uncertain and timeframes that were long. This was how things got built. She understood this and found that understanding it was sufficient. She did not need to be celebrated, she needed to continue. Christmas came and she spent it with Alina and Geoffrey and the children, and it was a good day, warm and full and unremarkable in the best possible way. The youngest child, now 5, insisted on showing Margaret her entire collection of smooth pebbles, which was considerable, and explaining the particular virtue of each one, which took some time but was entirely worth it. In the new year she began the 3rd notebook. She dated the first page and wrote the date carefully in the top right corner, and then sat for a moment with the blank page in front of her. She wrote, "The thing about beginning again is that you know more than you did the last time." Then she continued. The Duke of Ashbourne died in the spring of 1821, a Wednesday morning in March, in the bedroom of his house on Grosvenor Square. He was 64 years old. He had been in declining health for about a year, known to his household and his physician and a small circle of close associates, but not widely reported until after the fact, because men of his position managed even their dying with the same emphasis on public composure that they brought to everything else. His death was announced in the newspapers in the appropriate way, with appropriate language about his political service and his family's long history, and the loss his passing represented to public life. His obituaries were respectful and largely accurate in their descriptions of his official career, and almost entirely silent about everything else. Margaret read the notice in a newspaper that Alina Cross brought over on a Thursday morning, folded open to the relevant page. She read it once, at the kitchen table, with her hands around a cup of tea. Elinor sat across from her and did not say anything. When Margaret set the paper down, she looked at it for a moment longer, and then she looked up at Elinor, and Elinor looked back at her, and they held each other's gaze for perhaps 10 seconds in which nothing needed to be said because everything had already been said in various forms over the preceding several years. Then Elinor said, "More tea?" Margaret said yes. And that was how the death of the Duke of Ashbourne was received at the cottage outside Salisbury on a Thursday morning in March of 1821. She went for a long walk that afternoon alone on the roads she had been walking every morning for 3 years. She walked without any particular intention except to be moving and outdoors, and she let her mind do what it wanted, which was to move through everything from the beginning in a loose and unhurried way, not analysis, not reconstruction, just the movement of memory through its territory. She walked for 2 hours. The March countryside was just beginning to show what spring would do with it, the fields still brown but with the first hints of green at their edges, the sky a pale blue with fast-moving clouds. It was cold enough that she walked quickly, and her breath showed in front of her. She thought about what his death meant and what it did not mean. It did not mean that what had happened had been resolved. It did not mean that the women who had come before her or after her had received anything like the acknowledgement or the repair they deserved. It did not mean that the social machinery that had enabled his behavior had been dismantled or even seriously examined. He had lived his full life, in all its comfort and privilege, and died in his own bed, and the obituaries spoke well of him, and the institutions he had moved through his whole life had given him everything he had ever needed and charged him nothing for what he had done. This was the truth. She held it clearly and without softening it. And then she held the other truth alongside it, which was that the notebooks existed, and the copy of the parliamentary report existed, and the letters existed, and the small printed document that had been read by women in at least 4 cities by last count existed, and Catherine Phillip was still in London maintaining what she had always maintained. And there was now a third woman she had never met who was doing something similar in a different city, with different people in different circumstances, but with the same fundamental understanding that records mattered and connections mattered, and the ordinary, undramatic, unrewarded work of being available to women who were in the middle of situations they needed help understanding mattered enormously. These things existed alongside the obituaries and the respectful notices, and the unchanged great house on Grosvenor Square, and all the structures that had not moved, and were not going to move quickly. That was the actual picture, both parts of it, with neither part allowed to cancel the other out. She had learned over the 5 or so years since the letter in black wax arrived on the floor of a house on Gloucester Street to hold both parts of that picture simultaneously. It was not easy. It required a kind of internal steadiness that took a long time to develop, and that she was fairly sure she would be working on for the rest of her life. But she had developed enough of it to continue, and continuing was what mattered. She walked back to the cottage in the late afternoon and lit the lamp and sat down at the desk and wrote in the 3rd notebook for about an hour. She did not write about the Duke. She wrote about a conversation she had had that week with a young woman who had written to her from Bristol, a woman who was 20 years old and had come to London for a season, and had returned home more quickly than she had intended, and was trying to understand what had happened to her, and why she felt the particular way she felt about it, the way that was hard to name because the vocabulary for it did not quite exist in any form that was considered proper for a young woman of her position. Margaret wrote to this young woman with everything she had. She wrote about what the vocabulary was for what the young woman was describing, in the plainest terms she could manage. She wrote about the pattern that the young woman had been caught in, and why the pattern worked the way it did, and how it was designed. She wrote about what could and could not be done about it from the young woman's current position, and what the most useful next steps were likely to be. She wrote without pity and without hysteria, in the same clean, clear English she had always used in the notebooks, the English that said, "This is what happened, and this is what it means, and here is what you do." She had written perhaps 30 such letters by this point. Each one was different because each woman was different, and each situation had its particular details. But each one drew on the same body of knowledge, built from her own experience and Catherine's, and the women before them, and all the careful letters that had moved through the network over the years, and been read and stored and used. It was a form of knowledge that had no official name and no institutional home. It was simply knowledge that women in particular situations had developed and were passing to each other through the channels available to them, which were not the official channels and were not the public channels, but were the only channels that had been reliably open to them. This was how women had always transmitted knowledge that was not welcome in official forms. This was how it had always worked, before there was any language for it, before there were any institutions designed to receive it. Through letters and through networks and through third tables in tea rooms and through words slipped onto cards and tucked into reticules by people who risked something to put them there. In the summer of 1821, she traveled to London for the first time since she had left 3 years before. She went to see Forsyth, who was still in his offices near Westminster and who greeted her with the warm, measured courtesy of a man who had known her through a great deal and held that knowledge carefully. They talked for 2 hours. He told her about certain developments in the area of legal reform that were slow but real. He told her that her account, and the accounts he held from the other women, continued to exist in his files and continued to inform the questions he raised in the committees on which he sat. He asked her what she was doing and she told him, and he listened with the same careful attention that had always been his distinguishing quality. When she finished, he said that what she was describing was important work and that he was glad it was being done. "I am not sure anyone else would call it work," she said. "It is a collection of letters and notebooks and very quiet conversations." "The most significant work is often entirely invisible," he said. "It is only visible in the people it has made a difference to." She walked out of his offices into the summer London afternoon. She walked for a while through streets she had known and then not known and now found familiar again in a different way, the way you find places familiar when you have been away long enough to see them differently than you did before. The city was the same city, enormous and indifferent, and she was not the same person she had been when she left it, and the combination of these facts felt entirely right. She went to the library on Marchmont Street. She browsed the shelves for a few minutes. Then she went through to the reading room and sat down at the third table. After a while, a young woman came in. She was perhaps 22. With the particular expression of someone who has been carrying something alone for longer than is good for them, and has only recently discovered that carrying it alone is not the only option. She stood in the doorway of the reading room and looked uncertain. Margaret looked up. "Are you Mrs. Phillips' connection?" she said quietly without preamble. The young woman came further into the room. "I was told to ask for someone at the third table," she said. "I was told they would understand." "Sit down," Margaret said. "We have some things to discuss." The young woman sat down. Outside, London went on as London always did, vast and busy and entirely uninterested. In the reading room, in the lamplight, over a table in the corner, a woman who had been through something and had found a way to use what she had learned from it sat with a woman who was in the middle of something and had not yet found her way through. The conversation would last an hour. It would be followed by letters and by other conversations, and by the particular slow work of one person helping another person understand what they were dealing with and what they could do about it, and that they were not alone. This was not history, not in any form that history usually chose to record. It left no official trace and claimed no public victory and arrived nowhere in any story of the period that was taught to anyone. But it was real, it was happening. It had been happening for years, in this room and in others like it, in cottages and tea rooms and careful letters and notebooks locked in trunks with keys on chains. And it would continue to happen after everyone currently present in the reading room had lived their lives and been gone long enough for their particular names to have faded from all but the most devoted specialist memory. Things that continue cannot be entirely stopped. That was what Margaret had learned, slowly and at considerable cost, over the years since the November morning when everything began. She had it now, she intended to keep it. She returned to Wiltshire at the end of July, and the summer continued with its usual unhurried pace, and the garden demanded attention, and the letters arrived and were answered, and the notebooks accumulated their pages. Eleanor's youngest child was now old enough to carry her stone collection in a proper bag rather than her apron pockets, which Eleanor's aprons were grateful for. Geoffrey's practice had grown, and he occasionally sent clients to Margaret when they needed the kind of advice he could not ethically give from his position, the kind of advice that required someone to have been through the relevant situation themselves rather than simply having read about it. In September, something happened that she had not anticipated. A letter arrived from a woman who identified herself only as a friend of Frances Hartley, the name from the Duke's Theatre box, the woman who had been there that autumn evening in 1812 and had watched the Duke lean toward Margaret and had then looked deliberately away. The letter said that Frances had died in the spring, of an illness that had progressed quickly, and that Frances had in the last weeks of her life spoken of certain things she had never spoken of before and had mentioned, among other things, the name of a young woman she had met at a theatre box in the autumn of 1812 who had struck her as uncommonly clear-eyed. The letter asked whether Margaret was that woman and whether she would be willing to receive Frances's friend, who had something that had been left to her with instructions to deliver it to the right person. Margaret wrote back immediately. Frances Hartley's friend came to the cottage in October. She was a small, composed woman named Ruth Alderton, who had been Frances's closest companion for the last 10 years of her life, and who had clearly loved her with the particular steady affection that people develop for those they have cared for through long difficulty. She brought with her a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. Inside the parcel were 6 letters and a journal. The letters were from Frances Hartley and were addressed to no one, which was to say they had been written to be read but not sent, the kind of letters that people write when they need to say something and have no one to say it to. They covered a period of 4 years, from 1810 to 1814, and they described, in Frances's precise and somewhat sardonic hand, her own experience of an arrangement with a person she referred to throughout only as the Duke, without further identification, though the details made identification straightforward. The journal was more detailed. Frances had kept it apparently from 1809, and it ran to 1820, and it was the most systematic account Margaret had ever read of the internal experience of being inside such an arrangement, the way it operated on a person's self-understanding, the way it reshaped the person's sense of their own choices and their own agency, the mechanisms by which a person came to feel responsible for something that had been done to them. Margaret read it all the way through over 2 evenings, alone in the lamplight. She read it the way she had always read things that mattered, with complete attention and complete stillness. When she finished, she sat for a long while. Frances Hartley had been at the Duke's Theatre box in October of 1812 because she had been inside her own arrangement with him at that time, in its later stages, already beginning to understand what it was and what it was going to do to her. She had watched the Duke lean toward Margaret, this new young woman he had found, and she had understood exactly what she was watching, and she had looked away because there was nothing she could do about it, and looking at it was more than she could manage. She had never spoken of it publicly. She had lived in London for 8 more years after 1812, and then moved to the countryside and lived quietly and died at 43. Her journal and her letters had been given, at her instruction, to Ruth Alderton, with the instruction that Ruth should give them to the right person if and when such a person appeared. Ruth had heard of Margaret through the network. She had waited for the right moment. She had come. Margaret looked at the parcel and the letters and the journal on the table, and she thought about the autumn evening in 1812, when a young woman in a theatre box had met her eye for a fraction of a second, and then looked deliberately away, and about what that look had contained, which she could now, for the first time, read correctly. It had contained recognition. It had contained a kind of grief. It had contained the particular expression of a person who sees something happening and knows from personal experience exactly what it is and is in no position to stop it. And it had contained something else, some small thing that Margaret had stored without knowing why in the part of her mind where she kept things she needed to think about later, something that had functioned very quietly and very long after the fact as a kind of solidarity. She kept the journal and the letters. She added them to the files she maintained, the documents she had been collecting and preserving for years. They were in good company there. They joined her own notebooks, and the copy of the parliamentary report, and the letters from the network, and the small printed document that was now in its 3rd informal edition, because women kept making copies. All of these things together constituted something, a record, an archive, a collection of voices speaking in private about things that the public language of the age did not have words for. Ruth Alderton stayed for 2 nights and then went back to London. On the last morning she said, at the door, Frances would have been glad to know her journal went somewhere useful. Margaret held the door open. The October morning was sharp and clear, the trees showing their autumn colors, the fields beyond the garden wall already cut. "I will make sure it does," she said. She did. Over the following months she wove Frances's voice into the correspondence she maintained, not by quoting directly but by understanding better, through the journal, the interior dimension of what the women she wrote to were experiencing, and reflecting that understanding back to them in ways that told them she had been told by someone who had been in the same place and had found words for it. The women she wrote to felt this, though they could not have said why, the sense that the person writing to them truly understood, not in a theoretical way but in the way that comes from knowledge that has been lived and passed through and used. The autumn deepened into winter. The third notebook was nearly full. She bought a fourth. The letters continued. The network continued. Alina's children grew. Jeffrey's clients came and went. The countryside outside her window went through its usual motions, season by season, entirely indifferent to the human lives it contained and entirely necessary to them at the same time. In December, a letter arrived from a woman she had been corresponding with for 2 years, a woman in Manchester who had built a small version of the same thing Margaret had built in Wiltshire, a network, a correspondence, a quiet availability to women who needed it. The letter said that this woman's version was now connected to another version in Leeds, and that between the three of them, they were reaching women they would not otherwise have been able to reach. Margaret read this letter at the kitchen table in the December morning and felt something she had come to know over the years and to trust, though it never quite lost its quality of surprise, a feeling that the thing you have been doing in private and in quiet is slightly larger than you had understood it to be, that it has edges you cannot see, connections you have not mapped, dimensions that exceed your personal knowledge of it. She folded the letter carefully and put it in the file. Then she picked up her pen and wrote back. There is a particular kind of account that history tends to miss, not the great events and the famous names and the recorded speeches and the catalogued decisions of people with the institutional power to require that their decisions be catalogued. Those things get kept. Those things find their way into the archives and the biographies and the textbooks and the footnotes of the textbooks. History, as it is usually practiced, is quite good at preserving the record of people who already had everything needed to make records of themselves. What history is less good at is the other thing, the quiet accounts, the networks that operated in the margins, the letters passed between women who had no official standing and no institutional address and no claim to be making anything that looked, from the outside, like history. The notebooks written in the late afternoon in spare bedrooms and small cottages, the correspondence maintained through systems of mutual trust that had no written charter and no formal membership and no record of their own origins. These things existed. They were as real as everything else, but they were made of materials that the machinery of preservation was not particularly designed to receive. Margaret Harlow lived in her cottage outside Salisbury until 1836, when she moved to a larger house in the town itself, close enough to Alina and Geoffrey to be useful to them in the ways that had accumulated over the decades of their friendship, the ways that included being the person Alina's children came to with certain questions, and the person Geoffrey's clients were sent to, and the person the women in the network knew as the center of it. Though the center of it was a position that had no name and no title and no chair. She had been to London several more times by then, each time with more ease, the city having reduced itself from the enormous pressurized thing it had been in 1812 and 1813 to simply a large city she knew her way around. She saw Forsyth on several of these visits. He had moved from his committee work to a slightly more senior position, and the slow work of legal reform that he had been contributing to for years had produced, over the course of the 1820s and into the 1830s, a number of changes that were incremental and contested and fought over every inch of the way but were real. None of them were directly about the kind of situation Margaret had been in. None of them said, in any official language, what had actually happened to her or to Frances Hartley or to Catherine Phillip or to any of the women in the network. But some of them moved in directions that improved the position of women in certain kinds of situations by some degree, and Forsyth maintained that her documentation and the documentation he held had been part of the argument, part of the evidence for the argument, in the rooms where those changes had been worked out. She held this carefully. She did not overclaim it. She knew the limits of what could be directly attributed and what could not, and she was not someone who needed more credit than was accurate. She took from it what was true, which was that keeping records had not been pointless, that the patient accumulation of clear evidence by people in difficult positions had contributed, in ways that could not be perfectly traced but could reasonably be inferred, to outcomes that were better than they would otherwise have been. Catherine Phillip died in 1829. She had been in London her entire life, managing the things she had built there with quiet persistence, the lending library and the reading room and the third table and the system of connections that grew from it. She died in her own home, in her own bed, surrounded by 3 women who had all, at various points, sat at the third table and been told to sit down and that there were things to discuss. One of these women took over what Catherine had maintained, not in any formal sense but in the essential sense, the sense that mattered. Margaret received the news by letter and sat with it for a full day before writing back. She thought about the afternoon in the library on Marchmont Street, the woman in the blue coat with the sharp, observant eyes who had said, without preamble, "Sit down, we have things to discuss." She thought about what those words had done for her at a moment when she had not yet found words of her own. She thought about the particular courage it took to offer that kind of directness to a stranger, the courage of a person who had been through something and had decided that the most useful thing to do with having been through it was to be useful to others who were going through it. She wrote a long letter to the woman who was taking over Catherine's work. She told her everything she knew that might be useful, the details of the network, the contacts, the correspondence systems, the ways things had worked and the ways they had sometimes not worked. She wrote it over 2 evenings, and it was among the longest letters she had ever written. At the end of it she wrote, "The most important thing Catherine ever said to me was that I was not the first and not alone. You are also not alone. You have the whole of what has been built to stand in. Use it." The notebook she had been keeping since 1830 was the 5th. She was systematic about them, dating each page and keeping them in order in a locked trunk. She had decided at some point, she could not remember exactly when, that these notebooks should survive her, that there should be a plan for them and for the correspondence files, and for the copy of the parliamentary report, and for Francis Hartley's journal. She had discussed this with Geoffrey Cross, who had drawn up arrangements with the care and specificity that he brought to all legal matters. The materials would go, on her death, to a specific institution with the instruction that they be preserved, and that access to them be available to any person with a legitimate scholarly or personal interest. Geoffrey had asked her when they were working out these arrangements whether she thought anyone would care. She had thought about this honestly. "I think that in some years or some decades there will be people who are asking questions that these materials can help answer," she said. "I do not know exactly which questions or exactly when. But I think the questions will arrive, because the world moves, and as it moves the things that were difficult to say become easier to say, and once they become easier to say, people begin looking for evidence that others have been saying them all along." Geoffrey had nodded and written down the provisions she asked for. She was right, though she did not live to know how right. The notebooks and the files and the journal and the correspondence were deposited with the institution she had specified and were indexed, imperfectly in the decades after her death, and were consulted occasionally by researchers over the following 100 years, most of whom were looking for something slightly different from what they found, and noted the materials with interest and moved on. Then, in a period much later than Margaret's own time, when the questions had arrived in exactly the form she had anticipated, the materials were found and read carefully and understood for what they were: a meticulous, clear-eyed account of a specific situation, kept by a woman of considerable intelligence and practical skill, covering a period of years, showing both the detail of one individual experience and the broad pattern of which that experience was a single instance. The Duke of Ashbourne appeared in the histories, when he appeared at all, under his political career. His obituaries had been accurate in their claims about his public service. The house on Grosvenor Square had changed hands twice and been divided into apartments and eventually converted again, and was now occupied by something else entirely, the usual process by which the physical markers of one century's world give way to the needs of the next. The notebooks were in a reading room in an institution with good lighting and good climate control, available to any person with a legitimate scholarly or personal interest, exactly as Margaret had arranged. She herself left London in 1813 and lived in Wiltshire for the rest of her life. She died in 1840 in the house in Salisbury in her bed in the spring, 60 years old. Elena and Geoffrey were with her. Several of the women who had known her through the network attended the small private funeral, women from different cities in different circumstances, women who had in common that they had, at some point, written a letter or sat at a table with someone who understood, and who understood it as a consequence of something that had begun in November 1812, with a letter sealed in black wax and a young woman who turned it over twice before she opened it. She had 2 obituaries. One was a brief notice in the Wiltshire newspaper, noting her age and her connection to the local community and the survivors who mourned her. The other was a slightly longer notice in a small reformist publication, written by a woman who had known her from the network and who described her as someone who had spent her adult life doing quiet, patient, necessary work that she had done without recognition or reward and with consistent and remarkable clarity. This second notice was not picked up by any larger publication. It did not generate any correspondence or public comment. It was read by perhaps a few dozen people and then went where small notices in small publications go, into the accumulating paper record of ordinary human life that constitutes the vast majority of what has ever happened and the smallest fraction of what has ever been remembered. But the notebooks were there, the files were there. Frances Hartley's journal was there, in the institution with good climate control and the right kind of lighting, waiting for the people who would eventually know the right questions to ask. Margaret had known in the cool, clear-eyed way she had known most things, that this was how it would go. She had known it from the day she began keeping records, or perhaps earlier from the day in the library on Marchmont Street when Catherine Phillips said, "The most important thing a person can do is ensure that what happened was recorded by someone who was there." She had been there, she had recorded it. The world moved, as she had said to Geoffrey, and as it moved the things that were difficult to say became easier to say, and when they did, people looked for evidence, and the evidence was there in her own handwriting, on the pages of the notebooks she had kept since February of 1813, in the full understanding that no one might ever read them, and the complete intention of keeping them anyway. This is the shape of a particular kind of courage, the kind that does not announce itself, the kind that arrives in small actions performed consistently over many years in conditions of considerable difficulty, and without any reliable sign that the actions will ever matter in any visible way. It is not a dramatic courage. It does not make a good scene. It does not lend itself to the kinds of stories that get told loudly and remembered easily. But it is real, and it is consequential, and it is the thing, more than any other thing, that Margaret Harlow carried from the November morning, when everything began, to the April morning in 1840, when everything ended. She had turned the letter over twice before she opened it. She had noticed what it was, not fully, not in every dimension, but enough to pause, enough to register that the weight of it required care. And then she had moved through everything that followed with the same quality of attention, the same habit of noticing, the same refusal to look away from what was actually in front of her, even when looking away would have been considerably easier. She had written it all down. She had passed what she knew to the people who needed it. She had built something that outlasted her. And the notebooks were there in the reading room, in the right kind of light, waiting. They are still there. She had begun to understand in the years after leaving London that the work she was doing was not about the Duke at all. Not anymore, and perhaps not ever in the most fundamental sense. The Duke had been the occasion. He had been the particular form that a very old pattern took in the autumn of 1812, in a particular city, in a particular social world, with a particular young woman as its object. But the pattern was older than him and would outlast him, and the work that mattered was not the work of challenging him specifically, but the work of challenging the conditions that made him possible, the silence, the absence of vocabulary, the social machinery that converted the experience of women into something that could not be spoken of in any room that had any power. You could not dismantle those conditions by confronting a single man, however powerful, in a drawing room. Margaret had understood this with complete clarity by the time she left London. The confrontation had been necessary and she did not regret it, but it was not the work. It was only the beginning of understanding what the work actually was. The work was this: naming things. Accurately, precisely, without embellishment and without apology. Writing the names of things down in language clear enough to be understood by someone who had not been there. Making sure the written account survived in a form that could be found. Ensuring that each person who passed through the network added to it rather than simply taking from it, so that the collective knowledge grew rather than being depleted by each individual's departure from the situation. She had learned to think of it as a form of inheritance. The woman in the blue coat at the third table had inherited something from the women before her, from the accumulated experience of women in similar situations going back further than anyone could trace, and she had passed it to Margaret, and Margaret had passed it on, and the chain extended both backward into a past that was largely unrecorded and forward into a future she could not see. This was not heroism. This was not sacrifice. This was simply what it looked like when people with certain kinds of knowledge decided to pass that knowledge on rather than let it disappear. The knowledge was specific and practical. It concerned things like how to keep records in a way that would be credible, and how to reach people who could help, and what realistic expectations to hold of those people, and how to speak to a woman who was in the middle of a situation she did not yet have names for, and what the right thing to say in that moment was. It concerned the internal architecture of these situations, the way they worked on a person from the inside, the mechanisms they used, the particular way they made the person inside them feel responsible for things they had not done. This knowledge was practical in the way that all true knowledge is practical. It changed what people were able to do. Margaret taught it in the only ways available to her, through letters and through conversations, and through the small document that had now, by the late 1820s, been copied and recopied, and passed through enough hands that she had no idea how many copies existed or where they were. She taught it through the example of continuing, of being present and reachable year after year, of treating the work, as a real occupation that required real skills and produced real effects in the lives of real people, even if none of those effects would ever appear in any official record under her name. The official records said other things. The official records said that the Duke of Ashbourne had served his country well. The official records said that the Parliamentary Inquiry of 1814 had recommended a review of certain statutes. The official records said that legal reform in the relevant areas had proceeded in certain directions over the following decades. The official records were not wrong exactly, but they were profoundly incomplete, in the specific way that official records are always incomplete, because they can only see what their own categories allow them to see, and the categories available to official records in 1812, and for many years afterward did not include the experience of women in the situation Margaret had been in, which meant that the experience could exist, could be documented, could be carefully preserved, and still remain invisible to the official record until someone came along who knew to look for it and how. She had known when she arranged for her materials to go to the institution that this was the condition under which they would be received. She had accepted it. It was not a defeat. It was simply the timeline of the work, which was longer than any individual life, and required each person to hold only her part of it without needing to see the whole. In the last years of her life, after the move to Salisbury, she spent considerable time in the garden. Eleanor teased her about it, said she had become a proper country woman at last, which was what Eleanor had always been and had never required a decade in London to understand. The garden was productive and absorbing, and had the quality that all living things have of requiring your attention in the present rather than in any other time, which she found, as she grew older, increasingly valuable. She was writing less by then, not because she had run out of things to write, but because the network had other writers now, women who had been through the relevant experiences and had found their own language for them and were doing their own passing on, and she was less needed as a pen than she had been. She was needed in other ways. She was needed as the person who remembered how it had all begun, who could say, "I was there in the library on Marchmont Street, and I sat down and a woman told me I was not alone, and this is how we got from there to here, this is the shape of the work and why it matters, and why it will keep mattering as long as the pattern exists that made it necessary." She said this in various forms to the women who came to see her in the Salisbury house in the later years, women who were doing what she had done and wanted to know the history of it. She told them as much as she could remember and as much as was still relevant, and she answered their questions with the direct, precise manner she had always had, the manner that had originally come from a natural disposition toward clarity and had been confirmed and deepened by 25 years of using it in service of something that required it. She told them about the footman with the still face. She told them about the plain white card in her reticule. She told them about Catherine Phillip and the third table and the words, "Sit down, we have things to discuss." She told them about the notebooks and why she had kept them and what she had hoped for from them, which was not certainty but possibility, the possibility that the right person at the right moment would find what she had written and understand it as evidence of something that had happened and had mattered and had been attended to by someone who was there. The possibility was now a fact. The notebooks had been found, were being found, would be found again by people who came to the institution with the right questions. The questions had arrived in the form she had anticipated. The evidence was there to meet them. This is the thing about a clear and careful record. It waits. It does not decay in the way that unrecorded experience decays. It holds its information across whatever distance of time separates the person who created it from the person who needed it. And when the distance is finally crossed, the record delivers what was put into it with a fidelity that is sometimes almost impossible to believe. The exact words, the exact dates, the exact texture of what it was like to be in that situation at that time, kept intact by the simple fact of having been written down with complete attention by a woman who understood why it mattered. She died in April, as has been said. Elinor was with her. The spring had come properly by then, warm enough that the window could be left open, and the sounds of the street came in along with the light. She was not in pain at the end, and she was not frightened. She had done what she meant to do. She had passed on what she knew. The notebooks were in their trunk, the arrangements were in Jeffrey's files, the network was in other hands. She had turned the letter over twice before she opened it. She had noticed everything. She had written all of it down. She had made sure it would be found. The window was open. The April morning came in. Outside, the world continued exactly as it always had, without any particular regard for what had just concluded within the house. But the notebooks were there. And the notebooks said, she was here, and this is what she saw, and she was paying attention, and it mattered, and she knew it would matter, and she was right. She was right.